low on her list of priorities. In only a few weeks, the reaping awaited, and Nero didn't stop his sprints. "You've become a Real cunt," Clove supplied, unaffected, twirling a second throwing knife in her hand. "You're either a soldier or a princess, sweetheart. So make up your mind or go home. Your skills will hardly be missed." Swiftly, the redhead slapped her across the face. "I'm not the one who had to buy my way in." Clove let the comment roll off her back. "You couldn't even buy dinner, so that point's moot." Right as Dicey went for a second hit, one of the running soldiers diverted from his path and separated the two. "Do not deviate from the technique," Clove heard her first instructor say in the back of her head. "This isn't the fucking academy, children. Get back to work." The dark-haired girl's lips pursed in satisfaction as she punched the soldier in the face. Surprised, he fell to the ground, and Clove held him in place. She pulled another knife from her uniform, twirling it slightly, and sweetly said, "When I want your input, cadet, I'll ask for it," before stabbing him in the throat. Dicey's stomach clenched. Nero didn't stop sprinting. Neither did any of the other soldiers. Underscore 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 underscore. Tomorrow his unit, Unit 11, would descend upon the capital. Cato looked at the palm of his left hand, frowning. The grasp of the sword lingered even hours later. It felt unsettling to hold Hazel in the same hand, as if he could hurt the infant by mere association. He wanted a better future for her Sake. While the rest of his family ate, he kept an eye on her. She was happily trying to crawl on the bed. "I think you take after me, Hayes," he said, gently. She babbled on incoherently in response, and he felt his heart steady. This was what a family was meant to be, he thought. He felt an arm on his back. "You okay, Cato?" "Just nervous," he told his father. If they succeeded, if this long shot actually succeeded, she'd never have to endure the hell he'd gone through. That didn't stop his curiosity, though. What weapon would she have chosen? Oliver had been very vocal of his choice. That created a new curiosity in his line of thinking. How long would it have taken the Annex to take his pacifist, if not passive-aggressive, brother and turn him into one of them? Then his thoughts strayed to his own childhood. Had he ever had a chance? At what point had he crossed the insuperable line? Was this all for nothing? Was it too late to change? After all, you kill one man, you kill 100, what's the difference? 99, he heard Mars retort impatiently in the back of his head. And then his mind added helpfully, not to mention the 24 tributes carted off to the capital each year. As he pulled on his leather coat, Cato wondered about his father. While never naive to his capabilities, he'd been surprised by the extent of them, and in retrospect how much restraint he must have had when punishing him as a child. Certainly, his father was not as agile as the young soldiers, but he was surprisingly precise and lethal in his movements. It stirred a strange pride in Cato that the man with such a heavy hand very rarely used it anymore. He'd made it abundantly clear he only wanted to be two things, a husband, and a father. Cato wondered if he'd follow in his footsteps. Hazel gurgled, clapping her hands cheerfully, and he swallowed nervously. He'd do this for her. The clock was ticking. 2 days until, this twist was too sick to even contemplate. On the 75th anniversary, as a reminder to the rebels that the decisions of one affect many, the tributes will be reaped from the kin of the existing pool of victors without regard for age. Tomorrow, they'd invade. Underscore 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 underscore. Alternate ending, 8/12. underscore 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 June 75. These morons are incompetent, Clove grumbled, covering the salt and pepper-haired man. He was crouched in the corner, terrified, and for a moment, the 17-year-old girl became worried the man had actually been injured in the crossfire. Then she realized the red stain on his skin was dye and not blood. She dodged another dagger, smirking as she pulled it from the wall with a casual twirl. The duo of teenage rebels circling in on her froze for a moment and she smirked. Big mistake. In an instant, one of the girls fell to her knees, the dagger embedded in her chest. The other girl cried out and barely avoided Clove's throwing knife. Smirking, Clove trudged towards the girl. She looked to her fallen comrade solemnly, then back at Clove, and retreated. Bored, Clove didn't follow, ready for the next rebel naive enough to test her patience. On your feet. We need to move, Clove told the cowering man, not bothering to help him up. He stood up, shaking, and followed her. Will it go under? He stammered. Clove scoffed as she pulled the man along. She gave the city circle a once-over, gazing at the collapsed columns. Only hours ago, the tributes for the 75th annual Hunger Games had ridden through the path. Only a year ago, she and Kato had ridden through the path. She tried to erase the scene from her memory and focus on the present. She scowled. Nothing that can't be rebuilt in a day with the right workers. And as she looked at President Snow's mansion, she didn't doubt they'd ship all the district's men if that's what it took. Underscore 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 underscore. Nervousness gnawed through Felix's stomach as he opened the door to District 2 chambers as quietly as he could. Making sure Inoberia and Brutus wouldn't wake and ruin his efforts, he entered the familiar compound cautiously. He trailed through the shared living space towards the tribute quarters. Felix released a breath upon seeing her small, sleeping form resting the large, plush bed. He tried to stall the anxiety amassing in his chest at the thought of his potential failure and the costs it would have. Brutus was his grand mentor, but Brutus was practical. He wasn't sure he'd be spared by the man if he was caught. He certainly wouldn't be if Inoberia caught him. Gingerly, he entered the room, and picked up the child and held her protectively against his chest. You're gonna be okay, he whispered. Felix, the blonde child asked groggily, clutching onto him as she woke. He pat her back gently, hoping she didn't see his gun, and grow fearful of him in return. Can you be extra quiet for me, Brooke? I'm going to take you somewhere safe, all right? Brooke held on to him even tighter, leaning against him. Okay. Almost there. Good job, Felix praised quietly. I knew you'd come, a familiar voice accused. You're lucky I didn't warn them to expect that. Felix turned to the door. It's not luck. Nero crossed his arms in disapproval. He looked all wrong in the capital sleepwear, but Felix preferred it to the soldier's uniform. He preferred anything to the soldier's uniform. You must think I've lost my mind, Felix said, quietly. No, I think you know exactly what you're doing, Nero retorted, coolly. Which must look worse in your eyes, Felix murmured. She's my family. You both are, it's why you're here, and it's why I'm here. You think rather highly of yourself, Nero remarked, unimpressed. I was reaped because Clove is my cousin. Brooke's here because Wyatt is her father. Nothing more, nothing less. Wyatt Armoy does not give a fuck if the daughter he terrorized dies, Nero. Felix responded. The Capitol can use any legal justification they have to, but they know it's not Wyatt Armoy or Clove Holloway who will suffer most from your deaths. Nero leaned against the interior wall. These games are governed by strict laws, Felix. You know that better than anyone. Wasn't it only 5-6 years ago you told your first kill the very same? Maybe he had the right idea. I'll never know, Felix replied, honestly. A tribute can't desert their post because the odds are stacked against them. Brooke is a 4-year-old child, a 4-year-old child I dragged into this mess, Felix shot back, fire burning in his eyes. She will not die for my sins. I will make my own penance. You know, Felix, I'm still a capital soldier in case you forgot that. Though Nero made no move to assume protocol. Oh, trust me. I haven't, Felix replied, scathingly. It wears good on age. You. Not as much. A few years back, Felix, it could have been you. Don't act like I'm beneath you because I'm not a victor, Nero said in return. Felix sighed, irate, and not sure where even to start. I would never think I'm better than you. I only stand here now because of the dozen times you saved my life, that your family saved my life, but you get up in the morning and don the uniform of the people who enslaved me, who literally brought me to my knees to remind me of the dog I am, that I'm not even human, and that fact is crueler than your disbelief could ever be. So, you're right. It could have been me. I'm glad it's not. Felix Brooke complained, restlessly squirming in his arms. It's cold. He held her securely, trying to comfort her, but she continued to move. Call them in, you have to, but don't let her watch. Please do me at least that favor. She doesn't deserve that, Nero, he pleaded. He watched as Brooke looked to Nero with worry and confusion. Tears began clouding her eyes, and based on Nero's unease, Felix suspected this wasn't the first time. Nero, I'm scared. Nero said nothing, apparently uncomfortable. I want to go home to Annie, she mumbled, burrowing her face into Felix's shoulder. At that comment, the weight of Nero's apparent guilt crushed him as if he himself were carrying that burden. It hurt him to see his friend with such raw grief on his face, and he thought Nero would begin crying any moment, too. You don't have to do this, Felix said, struggling to stave off tears at his friend's deeply crestfallen face, at the painfully vulnerability he couldn't mask. You could come with us and leave this graveyard behind. We'd welcome you with open arms. I promise. Nero averted eye contact, and Felix didn't blame him, because if the positions had been reversed. If Nero had been the victor, the victim, the one trying to save a 4-year-old girl from sudden death, and he'd been the one who'd once been tasked with keeping Brooke and Srafina safe, he'd have just thought of his niece, and would have nearly caved. But, as a soldier, there was no room for compromise. You only followed through on the assignments given to you, and so he didn't blame Nero for averting his eyes, but that didn't mean he was going to stop trying. I love you, and I'm sorry you've suffered because of that, Felix said. I'd do anything to change it. That comment did get Nero's attention, and he hoped he appeared sincere enough that his words were a comfort and not something Nero felt he had to pick apart to better discern his motives. What? Nero asked, still looking shaken, but now also surprised. You've always been the best person in my life. You've always given me the benefit of the doubt, more than I could ever deserve, and I'm sorry I've never been a good enough friend to tell you that. I'm sorry my choices put you here. It isn't fair you were partnered with a child. None of this has been fair to you, and I wish it were different, Felix said, trailing off. Watching Kato rebuild his relationship with his father when they'd fled District 2 had only reopened the wound of losing his own family. When he'd come back a victor, he'd only just started to rebuild his relationship with his family, and it all had been cut so tragically short. In his suffering he hadn't been in a place to avoid making the same mistake twice. But as a rebel, as someone free of coercion, he'd finally made the choice to be unapologetically sincere, to begin growing into the person he could have always been, and to find redemption. Come with us. Please, he begged, and now he was crying. And this was all so stupid, so risky. He was wasting time, but maybe it was because he'd already made peace with his fate. As he held Brooke against his chest, he only hoped she knew how sorry he was for failing her. Nero took over a minute to respond, a minute Felix had used to better contemplate his death. I'm not in the interest of committing treason, Nero replied finally, very shakily. A few seconds passed and his shoulders slackened as he moved himself from the doorframe, providing them a path to freedom. With a failed attempt to recollect himself and gain the upper hand, he said, but I will show mercy just this once. Don't expect me to do this again. It was hope and grief in the same breath. Unfortunately, Felix had no time to ponder the fact that his friend had rejected him again. His willingness to defy had to be enough. As he passed the threshold, however, he only said to Nero, his eyes glimmering, this is why you were worth doing what I had to. And I'd do it again. The especially grief-stricken look on Nero's face in the wake of that comment left an ache in his chest. Grabbing a better hold on the 4-year-old tribute, he looked to Nero, and said, "Do whatever you have to get out of the arena alive, Nero." The sandy-haired teen only said softly, "It isn't just a game anymore, Felix. There seems to be more at stake than that. Glad you've finally figured that out. I'll see you on the other side," he said, patting his forearm for a moment, and then taking flight. Nero watched him doubtfully, a numb, unsettling feeling overwhelming him as he watched Felix disappear from sight. Underscore 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 underscore. July, 75. By withholding them of their brightest game technicians, the Synergy movement managed to stall the quarter quell for several days, which eventually spanned into weeks. Capitol officials assured the public that though the games were delayed, they hadn't been done away with yet. They were in denial. Watching Clove rise up as a symbol of Capitol compliance tore Cato's insides into a zillion little pieces, and yet he chastised himself for not being smart enough to have seen it coming. Her speeches, mechanical, cold, and demanding, struck terror in the public eye. Day in and day out, the screens played clips from the battle on the Capitol. The Synergy movement had lost approximately 275 soldiers, which statistically left every third bed empty, but they'd lost even more than that in morale. Harriet shook her head, turning off the television, and tried to send a reassuring look to her unit. "Gather round." She let out a sharp whistle and the discouraged soldiers amassed in a circle around her. The young men towered over her, and the young women looked ominous, worn. "Look, I know this looks bad, but we knew there were risks. The Capitol military is as old as the dawn of time, and their techniques stretch as far back as..." She spoke quickly, sharply, nervously. One of the teenaged girls let out a sound of dissatisfaction. "What about our friends, our bunkmates, our family members? Are we going to keep fighting blindly until our numbers dwindle so low they pluck us off one by one? We need more than flighty words from a little girl." Harriet tried not to look hurt by that response, but found it harder than she anticipated. She gave herself 3 seconds before pulling herself back together. "Our next plan will hit them where it hurts, but before we get to that stage, I have to do individual assessments to see where each of you are at." There was a sound of dissent, but she only shook her shoulders impatiently, huffing. "You're first, Elroy." He didn't say anything in return, only allowing her to usher him into the space she used a private conference room. "Congratulations on obtaining your Capitol official. I didn't expect any less of you." Cato shrugged, nonchalant. "I don't think he knows anything. Guy just sits in his cell all day crying and rocking himself to sleep. We haven't even touched the motherfucker yet. The guise of ineffectual behavior is low-toned and a last resort, but I still worry." "When aren't you worrying, Harriet?" Cato demanded, tiredly. "There is only so much more time before the Capitol grows tired of these games and comes after us directly. If our base is infiltrated, we will lose so much more than just men." He looked equally as put out as the rest of them. "Don't you think I know that?" Cato's thoughts unwillingly strayed to his brother and sister, then unpleasantly to his father and stepmother. He knew what was at stake. He thought about it constantly. "Did she? Do you think it's my fault this happened?" he finally asked her. "No, of course not, Cato. It's never been about you, any of them. This response is rooted in maybe a millennium of oppression," Harriet said, softly. "And while I have no doubt in my mind that Clove would die for you, and you for her, if her loyalty to the Capitol is as strong as her loyalty to you, then we're in danger." There was a defensive, uneasy expression written all over Cato's face, almost as if he wanted to be angry, but felt to do so would be inappropriate. Concern washed over her, as she quietly said, "Secrets are dangerous. If your secret is more important than your life, then maybe it's better if we assign you to a different unit." Cato gave her a menacing look, but she remained unaffected. "All I can do is be honest, Cato. Clove was the first person to ever show me kindness, first person to tell me I deserved better than what I came from, First person to challenge every idea I ever had for myself, and now. Sorrow underlined his every word, and now that person is gone. She's not Clove anymore, and everyone's looking at me to fix it, to shut her down, because it would have been too trite for the capital to play us as lovers, friends, partners. Instead, they reduced us to nothing but a number, the only number they ever told us matters since day one. But you know what? Fuck that. I won't kill her, and I won't let anyone else either. Your loyalty is admirable, Harriet replied. He looked up, surprised, but suspicious. The more and more I listen to Felix, the more I start to believe maybe he's not such a bad judge of character. He warned me, but I was too wrapped up in getting things done to really take his concerns into account. I don't think his judgment of Clove is one I'd trust, Cato replied, stubbornly. She gave him a small smile. Do you know how I met him? No, he shook his head. I had been just about to enter high school the year he won. The first teen to move in a decade. One day I saw him coming through the gates with a rather cute little rabbit nestled in his arms. So, I approached him and asked where he'd got it, and he gave me the creepiest smile before telling me he planned to roast it for dinner and... No wonder everyone thinks 2 West is prehistoric, Cato snorted. At first, I really thought he was going to torture it. That's what some victors do to quell their bloodlust. I started to lay it on a little thick with the tears, begging for him to spare its life, and he gave me the most bewildered look, like I was the craziest person he'd ever met, which was strange considering how weird he is, before telling me it was for his sister's kid and that I needed to get my head checked. Harriet leaned back in her chair, and finally admitted, I'm the one who voted against Clove, Cato, not Felix. She isn't ready yet, and until she is, involving her in anything has a severe degree of risk. She then added, I didn't factor for the amount of codependency between the two of you, and for that I'm sorry, but my observations stick for the time being. Cato rolled his eyes, perfectly aware they'd have been gouged out if he'd been talking to Clove. We are not codependent. You're never going to be happy if you don't accept that right now this is for the best. He put his hands together and gravely remarked, trust me, none of this has ever been about happiness. Underscore 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 underscore. They lost 286 men. Some estimates say that's as much as 1/3 of their reserves, Clove informed her father boisterously. Lieutenant Holloway looked at his daughter, unimpressed. We still lost 14 officials who will need to be retrieved. You were careless, Clove. The distress on his daughter's face at that assertion only bothered him. Why had they taken one of his only prized possessions and put her in such a precarious situation? He would have never allowed for this. Arrogance is unbecoming. You may be famous now that your face is on every single television channel, but I don't care about fame. I want Cato back, and I want him back now. The lieutenant remarked rather flatly, your boyfriend isn't in any danger. We've already assessed that he wasn't taken hostage, nor held against his will. More than likely, he is adequately safe whatever his circumstances may be. Crossly, Clove clarified, I think you misunderstand, sir. Cato isn't in danger. He is the danger. Pretty, skilled, smart. One misstep and he'll tear the whole place down. Just because you're so taken by Prince Charming doesn't mean others are, Lieutenant Holloway challenged. They've yet to use him as a symbol, Clove, and I doubt they will. In fact, the counter-movement doesn't appear to have a symbol, doesn't have a spokesman, only a leader, and a very dangerous one at that. There is only so much time left. Then tell me what to do. Clove pleaded, I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. Lieutenant Holloway hesitated, adjusting his daughter's posture slightly, and muttered bitterly, failing to meet her eyes, it's not your problem to fix. Just get some rest and we can regroup in the morning. He placed his hand on her shoulder for only a moment. If they could pull this off, if they could make this shot in the dark work, then maybe he could get her back. His wife had told him that regrets were for the old and post-mortem. That left the 40-year-old man wondering if that was where he was headed, towards an early grave. Lieutenant Holloway watched as the girl, with his humor and ferocity, But her mother's heart and resilience trailed away, exhausted and disenfranchised. Her hazel eyes looked back to him hopefully for just a moment before he realized where he'd made his first mistake. And what a mistake to make. Clove had inherited her mother's boundless determination to underscore 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 underscore. August, 75. Panic spread throughout Nero's lungs. Fire blazed overhead, charring the electrical wires led throughout the base's ceiling. There was a loud cackle, followed by a massive boom. Instantly, the base darkened. Several men cried out, trying to clear the air and reinstate order, but it was too late. Run, a few cried as they were bombarded by falling lights, shaking wires, and broken glass. Nero, take them and go. Lieutenant Holloway commanded, pushing him and a few others into a small, circular opening. Nero felt around the edge of the frame, trying to hang on to the edge. Behind him, another body laid in queue. Wait. What is this? He called out to his uncle, trying to keep himself from sliding down the tunnel and into the awaiting abyss. Move, move, move. Go, his uncle repeated and pushed the bodies down the chute. He hit the ground hard and began coughing as the stale and musty air rose around him. Before he had time to analyze the predated weapons hanging from the walls, he heard a stifled groan. In his discord, he'd forgotten about Clove. He pulled her up, making sure to keep her and their other companion, Dicey, safe. Everyone okay? Nero asked shakily. Dicey nodded, dusting himself off and looking around curiously. What is this place? Right as Nero was about to make his guess, Clove interrupted. I can hear the traitors, she said with a devious smile. Dicey and Nero leaned their ears against the wall, picking up the sounds overhead. Not bothering to dust herself off, Clove stood with a hellish smirk. In Clove's left hand was the threatening rifle, a select bunch of knives rested in her right. Pitiful that their last moments were spent wondering why they fought for a lost cause. The dark-haired girl stalked forward, both boys on her tail as she headed towards the front lines. Amidst the clutter, the trio waded, and rushed up the stairs. Once they opened the door, they saw an inferno blazing overhead, smoke drowning many of the fleeing capital soldiers out, but even in the distance the trio saw those that remained were fighting against the rebel invaders. As she looked at the frayed wires, Clove pieced it all together. It was easy to see that the fire had been initiated there. The rebels had probably meant only to short-circuit the wires, render the base unusable, but they'd failed. As had become a pattern for the novice scum, they'd gone a touch too heavy and set the entire structure alight. They'd soon regret that course of action. Infiltrating the capital soldiers' base was a heavy mistake. It was amongst the chaos that she spotted the raven-haired 19-year-old. She didn't doubt for a second this mess was his doing. I should have figured you were a part of this. You've always been a cowardly rat bastard. He gave her a dangerous smirk in return. You don't want to give me the opportunity to tear you down, H. Clove went to stab him. She frowned at the look of surprise on his face, but he quickly recollected himself. Clove, don't. Nero called out, rushing to the duo as the situation spiraled out of control. Felix maneuvered himself out of her grasp. The knife grazed the side of his abdomen and he sculled. Felix fell back, picking up his warhammer and yanking it out of her reach. The minute the flat edge of his weapon made impact with Clove's rib, she fell back, gasping. It was a non-lethal hit and they both knew it, but doubt still clouded his eyes as he watched her suffer through it. He scaled back. Guys, stop. Dicey called, trying to get between them. Am I supposed to stand by and let him kill me? Clove demanded, shoving Dicey out of their way with disgust. Why am I the one who always has to sacrifice herself? This is war, Dicey. Suit up or stay home. Testily, Felix shot, sacrifice what? Histrionics don't suit you, H. Let's your hope your soldiers are loyal enough to save your vindictive ass. Ready to bury Felix, her hand twitched, and she groaned. The pain in her ribs stalled her breathing. Dicey gave Felix an exasperated look, trying to aid Clove. Felix only turned the other cheek, refusing to be held accountable. Can we all just talk for a fucking minute? Nero snapped, frustrated at all sides. We just need a minute to run through this, and... Clove was about to tell him that time for talking had long passed when she was soon distracted by something much more important. She picked herself off the ground, gritting her teeth, and smirked. Well, Cato Elroy, Victor, rebel, traitor. Clove, he breathed in surprise. The blonde looked healthy, uninjured, well-fed, mentally stable. Maybe she was vindictive, because her initial reaction was disappointment. I forgot another one, she screamed, tackling him to the ground. Cato Elroy, corpse. Cato barely dodged the edge of the onslaught of knives. Clove, are you crazy? Dicey called out. What are you doing? Cato struggled for a moment, before she raked her nails down his face. Seconds later, he managed to fix both hands into a strong hold, effectively stopping her assault. Spitting on him, Clove grit out, give me one reason I shouldn't cut you up into a million pieces right now. In the background, Nero and Dicey continued to protest, but the chaos surrounding them prevented them from interjecting. I'm used to people I trust hurting me. I just didn't think you'd have to be one of them. He tried to rack his brain for a solution. It should have been easy, but when he looked at it from Clove's perspective, Cato kept coming up short. Because then we'll never know who has the highest kill count. For a moment, the nastiness in her eyes was gone, replaced by a mature contempt. Pretty sure if I kill you I win. Do you really want to end the game this early, Clovey? He asked, giving her a half grin from under her, wincing at the scratches marring his face. Her eyes narrowed violently. He let go of her hands and watched her intently, looking almost disappointed, hurt. Can we do this later? Felix demanded, breaking through the chaos to castigate the duo. The building is burning to the ground and the two of you are about to get us all killed. You can fucking kill me later, Clove, but right now we need to go. Clove raised her right arm to strike, when she was pulled off of Cato by her father. You don't disobey a direct command. Lieutenant Holloway barked. You stupid fucking kids need to retreat now. Right as Clove was about to snap in her defense, Lieutenant Holloway snatched Felix by the edge of his shoulder and demanded, where the fuck do you think you're going? He pulled Felix away and Cato leaped to his feet, ready to aid his comrade, but Felix shook his head as he was dragged away by the lieutenant. Just go. He snapped at them again. Before Cato had time to wonder why Felix was refusing his help, a girl from his unit stood before the group, Cato, Clove, Dicey, and Nero, her gun positioned directly at them. It was then Cato realized her eyes were lingering spitefully at Clove. As soon as Dicey realized so, he grabbed Clove's arm. Debris fell from the ceiling, nearly crushing them all as the smoke continued to spread. Nero looked at the rebel, who stood menacingly with her gun aimed at Clove's back. Run, he commanded of the trio. Dicey pulled Clove away, sprinting away from the rebel as quickly as he could. The rebel closed in on the remaining duo. Nero pushed Cato away from her line of fire and blocked the exit. Cato tumbled forward, barely regaining his footing when Nero screamed out, "Make sure to keep Clove safe." Dazed, Cato followed after Clove and Dicey, inhaling more smoke as he tried to keep up with the pair. Right as he hit daylight, he heard a bang, and turned back shakily just in time to see Nero sink to his knees, a gaping wound in his chest. Underscore 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 alternate ending 9/12 underscore 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 underscore. The synergy movement and the oppressive political figures in the capital held a few things in common. They had both taken battered, broken youth and melded them into hardened soldiers. Although these youth had long suffered through many a grave injustice, they'd always found solace in clinging on to one another. Cato was gunning towards his fallen friend when a forceful fist snatched the blonde's arm and dragged him away to safety. Nero heard the anguished screams of protest as whoever had taken hold of Cato struggled to hold him away from the entrance. Nero was only vaguely aware of the ruins collapsing around him as the chaos continued despite his disorientation. The smoke made it difficult to catch a single breath and he wondered how he'd go. Fire cackled, smoking many of the capital soldiers out. Nero. After trying and failing to focus his vision on the path ahead, he nearly fell forward, when a pair of muscular arms steadied him. Easy, easy, son. I'm going to find you a medic. Just relax. His uncle's steady arms held him in place, before reorienting him to lean his back against the lieutenant's chest. Though he was now more comfortable, it didn't change the fact that Felix was to his immediate right in full-fledged panic mode. I told you not to get yourself killed. Nero would have explained life didn't work that way, but decided against doing so. In Felix's eyes, once a statement was made it became a legally binding contract. His stomach lurched, which only briefly took the pain away from the gaping wound in his chest as he asked, I'm dying. I promised Mom I'd come home. No, of course not, you asshole, but Felix's tears hit his cheeks, immediately setting off a few alarms. Why are you crying, then? Nero reached clumsily for Felix's face, haphazardly trying to wipe away his tears. Hoarsely, he said, don't cry. You won. Lieutenant Holloway inspected his wound, instructing him with great concern to conserve his energy. The 18-year-old felt like a small child again, safe in the arms of the only man who'd ever believed his so-called compassion was a strength, but you can't cry for all of them. Most don't deserve your tears. And not a weakness. You think I give a fuck? Felix barked, hysterically. He choked a sob, a fuck about winning if you die. I hate you. I fucking hate you. His uncle scowled and pushed Felix away forcefully, you're not helping. Shut the fuck up, kid. Nero's skin became cold, his face losing its pallor, and he softly said to the pair, it's okay. Nee. Felix surrendered, tears streaming down his face as he rejoined them, calmer now. By the glassy, defeated look in his uncle's eyes, Nero knew he wouldn't make it through the night. Just, please don't leave. I don't want to die alone, he begged, tears dampening his cheeks. Not a chance, Felix said, firmly sticking by his side. His uncle ran a hand through his hair, murmuring in agreement. There were so many things he'd left unsaid, and not enough time to say what needed to be. He wanted to return Felix's sentiment. I love you, too. Even when you're a prick, even when you're cocooned in bed because the sadness is too much for you to bear. I love you, too, and I shouldn't have let fear of the truth separate us, shouldn't have been so doubtful that the people in power will create great injustice to keep us in line, and shouldn't have let myself hurt you because I was too afraid. But really what that boiled down to was, I wasn't worth it, Nero apologized, struggling to maintain a steady breath. I'm sorry I wasted what you gave me. Blood ran down the side of his uniform, staining the attire a scarlet red before making its way to the metallic floor beneath him. Felix shook his head, course you were new. Tears pricked the corner of his eyes, and Nero thought of the 8-year-old boy who'd hidden in corners and cried alone after his parents had died, how he'd always denied the fact when caught, never doubted it for a second. Perhaps what also contributed to his grief was the fact he knew his friends would suffer from this. This was the last thing he wanted to do to Clove, to Felix, to them all, because he knew they'd assign themselves the blame when really there was only one to blame. As his uncle pressed his hands against the bleeding injury, Nero found himself unable to muster the energy to inform the middle-aged man that he risked infection by pressing his dirty hands to an open wound. For every injury his uncle taught him to inflict, his mother had taught him how to nurse one back to health. Thoughts of his mother, he sniffled, wishing he could tell her everything and more. While never ungrateful, he'd never been particularly gracious either. I never got to see the finished garden, Nero recalled, as if he'd forgotten to lock the door before leaving home or had forgotten to pick up a cooking ingredient at the market. All that fucking effort compelling Felix and Aniston together, and he'd never seen the fruits of their labor. We'll make 101, and me. All the gardens you want, Nee. The two of us actually make a pretty good team. With Felix's prickly, acerbic personality that might as well have been considered a marriage proposal of its own. He thought of his fiancée's growing enthusiasm and lessening fear over time at the mention of Felix's name. It had been his small happiness, and he'd never see her kindness again. He tried to find comfort in imagining his fiancée's loving face, but instead he could only imagine it marred by grief, and that created an even greater sadness. "I'm sorry, Aniston. I would have done anything to stay." As they spoke, Lieutenant Holloway screamed for a medic to come to their aid, but the men and women continued to flee as another pillar fell to the ground and blanketed them in an additional layer of dust. "Don't let them hurt Clove," Nero moaned, his breathing accelerated as the wound continued to bleed from under his uncle's hands. "Clove's plenty safe," Felix growled, irate. "No, listen." He began to cough hard, exacerbating his wound even more and further staining his uncle's fingertips with blood. Threatened Nellie. Nero tried to take another breath to form a cohesive sentence, but started wheezing. "Snow did." "He did it, Lix." The lieutenant watched him carefully. "Snow said." Nero briefly lost his train of thought, letting out a hiss of pain. "He said he'd kill Nellie if Clove didn't get Cato." Nero closed his eyes, wincing, and wondered why he'd never learned how to self-treat wounds. "That's why," she cried. "That's why I came along, she needed me." Felix coughed as the smoke intensified. He cried out for help, offering himself up in exchange as a hostage as he tried to help Lieutenant Holloway stop the bleeding, but the base had been all but abandoned. Nero wanted to tell them there was no point. He was past the point of being saved anyway. Lieutenant Holloway held Nero like a young child, stroking his soaked hair, and giving him gentle praises of bravery, honor, and kindness. "Your bravery is admirable, soldier, but now you can take a break. You've earned it." "Earned so," his uncle's resolve broke, a sob caught in his throat. Nero watched through unclear eyes as Felix gravely struggled, and he figured this was his punishment for responding to his friend's disclosure as he had. Now he had to watch him fall apart for maybe the 5th time, knowing he could do nothing to comfort him. Nero found Felix's left hand and gave it a firm, supportive squeeze. "You're my best friend. You're my only friend, Nee. You're all I have," Felix pleaded, choking on his sobs. "You have to keep fighting. That's what tos do. We fight, and we need you, all of us, we need you." His breath was unsteady and he wished he had taken up Felix's offer, had dragged Clove kicking and screaming, but instead, here he was. "I'm sorry," Nero said, softly, and his own tears continued to cloud his eyes. "Promise you won't forget me." At that, Felix leaned into his shoulder, where his sobs grew uncontrollable. "Get you?" he asked, incoherently. "I'll never." His uncle continued to stroke his hair with great care and the look on his face only made things harder. "Uncle Bal, it'll be okay. Please just tell Mama I'm sorry," he croaked. "I love you, like you were my very own." "You know that, right?" his uncle replied, and Nero knew that had to be true because he'd never seen his uncle in such a state. "You've always been the best mix of brick and ebony." Brick, he would have been so proud of the man you've become. That brought him joy and he let his heart swell. His wound bled increasingly out of control, leaving Nero to realize his time was rather limited. He wasn't sure he was ready to confront death, and he wished he could be more dignified, but he continued to sob, still scared. Nero collected a breath, ready to read his last rites. "Just, don't let Snow get away with it." He looked at Felix with a hard edge and demanded, "Wreck the bastard." "I will," Felix replied, and his friend held his hand, still shaking. Nero closed his eyes. "Good," he voiced, relieved, smiling as he succumbed to rest as his uncle kissed the crown of his head, whispering sweet nothings. "Good." To Nero, nothing mattered more than dignity and courage, and how he'd always felt he fell short of both. But he could rest easy, knowing that he'd finally achieved both, if only for a brief moment. Underscore 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 underscore. Clove didn't have a clue what the hell was happening, but there'd be hell to pay once she figured it out. Dicey had ambushed her into the now flying hovercraft and subsequently prevented her from escape. When she had continued to struggle against him, he'd found the same pressure point she'd used against him as a child, rendering her unconscious. When she awoke, disheveled, and without any knowledge of where the hell the rickety hovercraft was supposed to be headed, and then was subsequently informed that Nero hadn't survived, she had nearly exploded. They'd left her to simmer without a word. Too bad their curious eyes refused to leave her furious form. What the fuck are you staring at? The battered and broken rebel soldiers only looked to one another, refusing to say much, until one looked to Clove's father and spat, "We didn't know he was your father. Have to wonder how good of a leader he'll be with you as a liability." "I am not a liability to the synergy movement." "Fuck yes you are," the soldier challenged, vindictively. Cato looked up, aggrieved, and demanded of anyone who could tell him, "What the hell is going on?" "Lieutenant Holloway is secondary leader for the synergy movement," our secondary leader Felix said, a wisp of himself in his unyielding sadness. He looked faintly to the frail girl hiding in the corner amongst her grief and then back to his burns covering his arms. "With Lime no longer with us, he is first in command now." Dicey, Cato, and Clove's eyes all flashed in surprise as a sickening understanding descended upon them. Tears of anger filled Clove's eyes and she began to shake. "Clove," Cato had begun. "No," she screeched out, scouring away from the collective as if she'd been drenched in industrial-grade hydrochloric acid. The 17-year-old began to rock herself back and forward as she screamed through broken sobs, "I don't understand. Nero died and you're willing to carry on the torch of his killers." "I fought for your freedom and for the freedom of us all," Lieutenant Holloway said, numbly. "You were always going to be under capital command, and that isn't something I want for my child. The crimes they commit against the tributes." Clove made a sound of dismay. "I'm not a fucking child. What difference does it make, shuffling me from one cattle herder to another?" "There is always a lesser of two evils," her father replied. "And you sincerely believe this is it?" she derided. "I'll sure remember to be grateful, then." "Maybe you should be," Clove Dicey said, finally. Her eyes flashed angrily. "Don't fucking talk to me. You left Nero to die because your life was more important than his. So you don't get a part in this conversation." "Clove. Tell me, Dicey, how long have you been on their side?" she asked, coldly. He was quiet, but didn't deny the accusation. "My loyalty is to those who are loyal to me." Clove's barely contained rage unnerved him as she spat, "Dead 4 hours and you've already forgotten how many times Nero took care of you." "I wasn't expecting for him to die," Clove Dicey pleaded, trying to swallow the lump in his throat as tears welled up in his eyes and then fell in rivulets. "He was my best friend and—" Clove let out a cruel, pained laugh. "I'll make sure they engrave that on his tombstone." "You're pathetic." Dicey was beautiful in his disintegration and began a wild descent into a full-fledged panic attack. Inevitably, Lieutenant Holloway came to his side, murmuring quietly to him to help steady his heartbeat and catch his breath. "Stop," Lieutenant Holloway ordered her eventually, looking disappointed in her. "Kid might be dumb, but he's not spiteful. It wasn't anyone's fault but those who set us at war." There was a murmur of assent from the soldiers. Clove had forgotten about them in her blind rage, and felt even more foolish as she cradled her knees against her. The humiliation only further exacerbated her grief. "We'll get you something to eat when we get there," Lieutenant Holloway said quietly to Dicey. "I don't think I'll be able to hold anything down," Dicey croaked out, shaking his head. A familiar grasp took hold of Clove and began stroking the back of her hand gently. Tears continued to cloud her eyes. Clove pulled away and began to beat on his chest. "Why do you hate me so much? What did I do to you?" Felix gave her an unsympathetic face in return, shaking her shoulders. What happened to the Clove who was willing to defy the capital and sacrifice herself so someone else could get a second chance at a new life? Where is that person? She gave him a venomous look and he added gruffly, speaking almost too quickly. "I had to try, or I was going to be stuck as a capital slave for the rest of my life, and I'm not brave enough to be a martyr. I couldn't live one more day knowing that if I said or did the wrong thing in some fucked up encounter that inevitably they'd pick off my friends one by one just like they did with my sister and Roxanne. And I must have made a mistake somewhere, because you were reaped and Dahlia was killed, and the worst part is I still don't know what I did wrong, and it would have just continued forever until no one was left. Clove remained numb. Not everyone gets lucky enough to win the games with the love of their life, with anyone else, but you did, and yet you're still willing to throw that all away. Come back to us, H. We can't do this without you. What are you talking about? Clove demanded, overwhelmed by chorus of public opinion. I want to go home. Take me home right now. I'm tired of this game and I want to go. She got her feet, looking to Kato, who barely made eye contact with her and then darted towards the emergency escape door. 2 soldiers caught her before she made it to the edge, forming a barricade. A crazed look haunted her hazel eyes. Let me go. Clove screeched. She needs to be sedated, sir. Let me go. Let me go. Clove was dragged to the edge of the opposite wall by the soldiers and received by her father. She curled up in a fetal position against her father's chest as sobs racked her body. The lieutenant sent a warning look to the soldiers and allowed Clove to cry against him. Underscore 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 underscore. No one was handling any of it very well. Concern had radiated every cell of Kato's skin when they'd exited the hovercraft and had made their way into 13. Felix might as well have been comatose and Dicey was perhaps only one step above him, so Kato felt the ice around him begin to fracture. After accompanying Felix to the infirmary and helping him get an initial round of medical care, Kato had successfully guided him into the dining hall. Dicey was sitting with Clove's father, trying and failing to keep anything down. It was there Felix completely crumbled. Once the tears came, they didn't stop, and Felix cried desperately. Kato took a breath and pulled Felix into his arms, mumbling, "You did everything you could. More than anyone else could." Felix sunk into chest and his anxiety stalled for a moment, but then the moment he began to calm down, his erratic breathing immediately began again. Kato shuffled awkwardly, trying to figure out the right to say, rubbing his friend's back, but things continued to escalate. He considered taking him back to the infirmary when Dicey carefully pried Felix from him and into his own arms, which was successful in allowing Felix to catch his breath. "Dicey," Felix mumbled. "I know," Dicey replied, holding him firmly. He began to explain softly to Kato, "Nero was my roommate, and the adjustment to being a capital solider wasn't easy. He and Clove would tell me constantly to go home, but when he came back from the cancelled quell, he was different. Nero finally heard what I had to say and tried to be comforting, and..." Dicey looked up to Kato, mumbling quietly, "When I hugged him, it reminded me of you, so I'd say the inverse is probably true, too." Kato hadn't considered that. Felix eventually broke their grasp and sat down at the table, leaning his head into the palm of his arms. "I killed him. When he got back from the quell, he had a lot to say," Dicey continued, "and when he told me, you know, the whole thing and everything from you taking Wyatt Armoy's daughter from the living quarters, I wasn't very sympathetic to his plight, and maybe I should have been, but I was just so angry at him for the things he'd said, and it didn't make a difference. I couldn't convince him. Maybe," Dicey said, "but as he was telling the story back, and maybe it's just how he told it back, all I could think about was why he didn't believe you in the first place. As if someone like you, someone whose whole image was shoddily built on ruthless indifference, would lie about that sort of thing, as if it could bring you any benefit. As if our friend would lie about that sort of thing out of spite." And the more I just looked at him like I couldn't believe what he'd said to you, the more he just unraveled, but someone had clearly already been working this, because he looked so put out at that point, like he just needed to tell one more person so he could work through it. If Aniston was on my side, she should have said something when it mattered. Doesn't do anyone any good that she couldn't speak her mind." "You think it was her?" Kato asked, surprised. "Well, unless Nero was telling every stranger he encountered, it could only have been her. So, she and I get to shoulder the responsibility for Nee's death together for the rest of our lives. Let's hope it's a long one." "Didn't you hear the lieutenant?" Dicey asked. "It's no one's fault but those who set us at war." "And you believe him?" "Yeah, I do. And you want to know why?" Because I'm not going to take responsibility for this, and I'm sure as fuck not letting any of you either. The Capitol did this. This war wouldn't have happened if they hadn't enslaved you and the countless others out there so they could continue to line their pockets, and this war wouldn't have happened if we hadn't spent our entire childhood training to murder children from outlying districts so purple-skinned socialites could have something to watch on TV every summer, and... Dicey, it's okay, Cato said, his face full of concern. With every octave higher Dicey's voice escalated. No, it's not okay. This war wouldn't have happened if the working conditions in the quarries weren't so terrible that they kill more and more of our people every year through their blind negligence, and I'm tired. I'm tired of pretending any of this okay, Cato. None of this is fucking okay. And maybe Felix hadn't expected the ardent zeal from Dicey, because he only murmured, have you always felt this way? Since your parents died and my mom was nearly paralyzed. The rock slide of '65 affected so many people, and when I think of capital opulence and compare it to the cost it would take to make the quarries just a little safer. Yeah, me too, Felix said, softly. That's why you wouldn't spend the prize money. None of that was going to bring Ro and Jade back. The lieutenant came to their table, studying them wearily. You could be a speechwriter, kid, and I mean that, he said, quietly, but maybe now's not the time. Dicey nodded, faintly. You still need to eat, he said. The lieutenant then handed Dicey his ration of fruit. When Dicey shook his head to refuse, the lieutenant rolled his eyes and gestured to the kiwi, can't have this around anyway. Dicey exhaled, picking through it, and picked up a slice with his fork, sarcastically toasting, it's not like Clove plans to ever talk to me again anyway. Underscore 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 underscore. Perhaps Clove was right. They had traded one holding cell for another. Every hour in District 13 was dictated by a swatch of ink on your arm, and modifications rarely came cheap. Their new command had asked him to be soldier on guard overnight, and he wondered to himself what there was to guard against, considering how obedient residents of 13 were. To make things even better, when he wasn't working or sleeping, they were run ragged by the intensive physical training prescribed to them. So, Dicey stood in the corridor waiting for intruders each night, but no one ever beckoned into the abandoned hallway. That is until one impossibly late hour a few weeks into their stay. Paths off limits. The wavy-haired brunette smiled at him, not bothering to look guilty despite having been caught breaking a half-dozen rules all at once. Don't you ever get hungry on watch? He studied the teenage girl carefully. Nothing I ain't used to. She frowned at him. How effective of a guard will you be if you're not in prime health? Look, I get it. You're hungry. Go to bed now, and in the morning you'll have breakfast before school. Hell, you should be grateful you're still in school. Actually, I already finished school. Dicey arched a brow, doubtful. You look like you could have gone to school with my little sister. He didn't mention his sister was a half-foot taller than her, too. The girl gave him a cheeky smile. I had more important things to learn, but I learned pretty quick that it's hard to do anything on an empty stomach. Subtlety clearly was not a part of her routine, but as the wall behind her blurred a bit, Dicey felt himself in agreement. He blinked, touching his face, and nodded slightly. Just this once. All right. What's your name anyways, soldier? Dicey, the auburn-haired teen replied, half-heartedly. Well, I appreciate your help, Soldier Dicey. Still weary, he corrected, Soldier Wilder. First name, Dicey. Are most soldiers in 13 this informal, sir? What game was she playing now? I'm not exactly from around here, Dicey remarked, rubbing the tiredness out of his eyes. No need for formality, just Dicey will do. The young girl was cute, friendly, but clearly 100% full of shit. The redhead fully intended to find out what was behind the mask. And your name? Harriet, she said, tucking a wavy strand of hair behind her neck. You're not from around here either, are you? He asked, smirking slightly at the way she walked, as if bouncing around on a cloud. She definitely wasn't from around there, not with the baby fat around her waist and the flush in her cheeks. She actually looked somewhat healthy. 13 only looked minimally adequate. So where are you from, firecracker? Harriet looked back at him, slightly troubled, and quickly fibbed. Nowhere important. So, like District 12. No, she answered, continuing her dance walking. Somewhere far less homely. Dicey wouldn't have called District 12 homely in any sense from the snapshots he saw during the reapings each year. Maybe she was referencing the swaying pine trees, but even that seemed unpleasant when he thought about District's apparent lack of technology. Like District 10, he asked, thinking of the drove of livestock, and grimacing. 2, actually. Don't be so quick to sell out your district. It's all you have left, he admonished. His first instinct was to ask what region she was from, but she interrupted his thoughts, remarking, "You're right. Sorry. I do miss my home. At least in District 2 I knew where I stood," then Harriet added. Maybe it was the delirious exhaustion overwhelming him, but Dicey was so tired of whatever game he'd become a part of. He wasn't a soldier. He was an 18-year-old kid. Watching the teenage girl before him made him realize how much he'd lost and how much he didn't want anyone else to lose it, this gumption. "I think I got just the thing you're looking for." Dicey pulled a golden bracelet off of his wrist and snapped it onto hers. "Friend of mine gave me that." "The tribute bracelet," Harriet remarked, stunned. "Which friend?" And that was the question, because each of his friends had been a tribute for two at some point or another. At one point, that would have carried major bragging points. Now it was just a foreshadowing of something bleak, as if to say you can escape once, but you don't get lucky twice. "Figuring that out is up to you," he teased as he led her to the kitchens. With a stirring of carefree mischief, Dicey smiled, and leaned his arms behind his head. "Come on. Underscore 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 underscore. September had used to be his reprieve. Now Cato suffered from a sorrowful, gut-wrenching and guilt-racking knotting of his stomach that never ebbed. He'd thought he could only feel such a level of distress in regards to Clove. He'd been unpleasantly surprised by how much Nero's death wore on him on a daily basis once he'd gotten through trying to help Felix through it, and how his failure to come to his friend's aid had only tightened the nail in his friend's coffin. He realized too late that despite his own misgivings, Nero's irksome need to play peacemaker had actually kept their group intact most of the time. Funny, considering their environment growing up. Bless his father for trying, but Cato couldn't help but to feel indignant when he thought of how many times he'd beat him as a child and how most times Nero had been the one to put him back together. It felt wrong to accept his help now, disrespectful to his friend's memory. It was hard to go it alone. Felix had quickly immersed himself in the third component of Lime's original strategy, while Dicey's time was consumed by their training by day and his duty to guard by night. Cato had always expected their reunion to be a happier, exhilarating rush. That had always been the plan between the two of them, bringing Clove to the right side, and returning to their old routine once the dust settled, but his miscalculation had reaped consequences of its own. Hazel was closing in on a year come December and had become sick, colicky, leaving him increasingly worried about the splotches across her cheeks. He wondered if he had made the right decision to expose his family to this war. Oliver and Brooke seemed healthy enough, considering the conditions in 13. Watching Felix try to care for a needy, dependent little girl alone would have been hysterical if he didn't think one day the man would combust from the pressure and destroy her in a fit of anger. Once in a while Cato saw Clove getting her meals, conversing solely with her father, but only in short, carefully crafted sentences. She hadn't forgiven him yet, either. The third day they'd been in District 13. She'd held on to her butter knife with such intensity the guards had revoked the privilege and she'd been forced to eat with forks and spoons only. He later heard Dicey say that Clove's tirade had been about, what else, her sister. Lieutenant Holloway had been quick to his feet assuring her that her sister was somewhere safe, but never saying any more. A few more days passed before Clove demanded to know the precise whereabouts of 14-year-old Magnilda Holloway. The look in her eyes alone nearly burnt District 13 to ashes when his reply had been Indra Wilder. Dicey hadn't been pleased, either, to learn that his mother had trained for the games and had once been quite a contender, when she'd always gone around letting him and his siblings think she hadn't, but he'd made sure to inform Clove that Callan would protect them all, and that he'd been training Hallie on the side for years. Cato wondered if that was supposed to bring her comfort. Even if Hallie had been trained on the side for years, Magnilda surpassed them both. 16 days had passed and Cato had given Clove her space, given her all that he could by removing himself from any conflict. So, on the 16th evening he found her returning to her bunker and pulled her aside. "We need to talk." He said it almost self-deprecatingly, as if he knew he sounded like a cliché from every bad capital movie they'd ever seen, which totaled up to about 3, maybe 4. "What could you possibly have to say for yourself?" Clove replied, "None," then added sardonically, "Is this where you officially break up with me?" There was certain relief that her initial response hadn't been anger, but he wondered if this alternative was any better. Looking at her now, dull, lifeless, a totally different visual from the girl he'd gazed longingly at while she painted, made him feel like he'd misused a trio of high-quality knives and ruined the handles. Not a chance. Cato hesitated, before moving forward and running his fingers through her hair distractedly. Clove didn't protest, so he brushed his lips against her forehead, and trailed off, He imagined this was how addicts felt before a relapse. "I just wanted to tell you that I really am sorry. I know part of this is my fault and for the rest of my life I'll carry that burden, but I'm done making excuses for myself. So, if you ever need me, I am here for you any time, any day, for any reason, no questions asked." Clove contemplated the words silently. It was a tempting offer, and she despised her weakness, wanting nothing more than to fall into his arms and ask him why he'd left her when they'd made so much progress. Nero's corpse helped reinforce her disdain. "What if I don't want your services?" The blonde looked stumped, but by the accusatory flicker in her eyes, Cato knew this was all but a test. With Clove that was pretty standard. "That's your choice," Clove Cato admitted honestly, rubbing his neck uneasily. I want to be deserving of you, and I am going to prove to you that I can stand up as a man and protect my family. No more excuses. So if that takes time, then whatever, I'll wait. You're worth the wait." Her skepticism and cynicism hurt, but Cato knew he deserved all that and more. Clove crossed her arms, and spoke tightly, but not meanly. "You seem so sure I'll come crawling back." An cocky smirk came over him. "Under that 120 pounds of skin, bones, and ferocity is the kindest person I know." Clove snorted at that, because Cato was definitely the only person gullible enough in the world to think so. "For now, I will wait, because God knows you've waited long enough." "Cato!" Clove called out, then looked away indecisively. "Never mind." He gave her a brief glance of encouragement. "You can trust me, Clovey." "Can I?" she asked, cynically, and boy if it didn't break his heart at the sound of her defeat. Clove studied him for a moment, wondering if they'd ever pick up where they last left off, and decided it was another day's problem. Turning back to him, Clove only said, "I'll think about it." Underscore 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 underscore. "What's the next phase?" one of the young soldiers asked, following Harriet in breakfast line the next morning. She took her share of the slop District 13 tried to pass off as food and arched her brows, slightly on edge. "Soldier Exil, I've told you, I don't know. The Synergy movement is dead, gone, K-pitch." The brown-haired teen smirked. "We're not dead, so it's not dead." Harriet admired his nerve, but sighed. "Look, Isaiah, I like you. A lot actually. I used to actually have a major crush on you, but as a movement we no longer exist. We're a part of District 13 now and they call the shots." Isaiah smirked, cockily. "You know I'm gay, right? And 16 is a couple years too young for me, too. Thanks for making me relive the pain of when I first found out." He then redirected, "So, what, we're going to let these Rugrats lead us? We're District 2, kid, no one knows how to fight harder than us." Harriet leaned back. "Well, when my mother decided her loyalty to her comrades was stronger than to her daughter, that's when I ducked out. I can't help you. Come on, Harriet. Lime didn't give her life up for nothing. I know you. I've seen you with that capital soldier. You have to have something up your sleeve. A moment of silence passed, before Harriet looked him dead in the eye, and rubbed the palms of her hands together. She only gave him a vague response, someone does, but it's not me. Underscore 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 underscore. Fuck, that hurt. Clove yelped, rubbing the red mark across her face from where the door had made impact. The pair made eye-to-eye contact, with Felix rolling his eyes. Felix crossed his arms, wiping away the surprise on his face and replaced it with a knowing expression. "'S what you get for being a sneak, H." She scowled at him in return. "Let me guess," Felix began, arrogantly. "You came here to tell me how much of a bad boy I've been." A moment later, he turned again. "Nah, that's not it. No, you're here to ask if what I said is true." "I'm not stupid," Felix Clove said, glaring at him. She shoved him against the wall, hoping to shake the pomposity from place. "I know it's true. The question I have is why." Felix moved to close the door, but Clove inserted herself in the space between the door and its latch. In the corner of her eye, she saw Brooke laying on the bed, asleep. "Because I really enjoyed being violently sodomized by men and women alike," he spat. "Now, fuck off." Clove pursed her lips together. "Felix. I'm serious, H. I'm 100% done talking about my fabulous life as a high-class hooker," he replied, quieting down. "Why do you care anyways? Clove Holloway doesn't do personal debts." "You're deranged," Felix scoffed. "No one's keeping score in the middle of a fucking war." "Seems to be a long-running scroll by all accounts," Clove said, shrugging. "As much as I'd love for you to owe me, there's not much you can really do unless you want to rehash the games, be my mentor, and sell your body for a month to get me allergy pills and trail mix, and hell maybe you could throw in a box of tampons and a platter of iced cookies, too. I've never seen you go down without a fight, so tell me, why would you let them do this to you?" "Same reason you did," he said harshly, pulling his hand from her, and refusing to meet her eyes. The aura was all wrong. Pity was one thing he couldn't use. Felix looked up reluctantly, catching her wary expression. "Nero said that President Snow threatened your sister," he said. "He killed mine, and I knew he wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone else he thought I cared for. That's why I did it." Clove ran a hand through her hair at the mention of Nero. "I keep waiting for him to come back, for him to turn a corner and prattle on about his wedding and Anne's favorite hors d'oeuvres." "He's not coming back," Felix said, plainly. "He's dead. The Capitol made sure of that. Don't blame the Capitol for this one. You fucking rebels killed him. Nero was on our side and your spineless soldiers fucking shot him," Clove snapped. "Maybe I should have let it be. At least Nee would still be alive, but what would you have done?" "I was scared every fucking day, H." "I don't know," Clove said, honestly. "How am I supposed to justify what they did to you? There had to be a better path than the one you all took, but I can't support what they put you through. Does it better your self-esteem to see me knocked down a couple of pegs? To know just how little power I held this whole time?" She stared back at him, only remarking, "I guess I don't see it that way." "Of course not," he retorted, rolling his eyes. "Because inevitably, I would have cracked," Clove finished, cutting him off. He looked to her now, more attentive, "But you didn't. I don't see this as knocking you down a peg. No, the way I see it, you were relentless in the face of danger. If anything, it only reinforces what I already knew about you, that you're one of the gutsiest fuckers I know." And she didn't want to think of what he'd done every time he was whisked away to Capitol by his captors, didn't want to think about how it could have been Cato, how it could have been any of them, and how being raped once was enough to fuck up Cato, but for it to be so regular, so part of your routine. It made her stomach lurch. "I guess I'll take that as a compliment," he said, softer now. "How are your ribs?" "Just 2 weeks," Clove replied. She stared at him, making him rather uneasy, and then angry tears began falling from her face. Is it that bad? Felix managed, surprised by her tears but trying to have some restraint. I tried not to cause long-term damage. I thought I'd maintained more control. They're fucking sick, she interrupted, her face reddening in an angry grief. You've barely aged a day in 5 years and they still wanted to do those perverted things to you. You still look fucking 16. Felix wasn't sure how to respond to that. While it didn't behoove his survival to consider that, he was pretty sure that was supposed to be the appeal of bedding the little brother Victor. It's over now, he replied, resigned. It's okay. How is any of this okay? What do you want me to say? I can hardly console myself and now you want me to make you feel better, too. Fuck off, Clove. His anger seemed to steady her. For a moment he wondered if she'd have believed him when Nero hadn't. He wondered to himself how having her by their side from the very beginning could have changed things, but that was dangerous thinking, so he stopped himself. If you really feel like you owe me anything, then I know how you can make good. She stared at him, curious, but defiant. Fine, what do you want? You need to make up with Dicey and Cato. Felix, this isn't some stupid children's fight. They got Nero fucking murdered. Clove snapped. That's not true, and you know it. Nero wanted Snow demolished. I don't think he blames his best friends for his sacrifice, and if you continue talking about Nee's death that way, you and I are going to have a problem, H. Clove gave him a reproachful glare. Exasperated, Felix added, be mad, but stop acting like Cato did all of this on his own, because he didn't, and you know it. Nero wanted you to be safe. He wasted his last words on you and you don't even recognize how lucky you are. Your two closest friends are here, in peak health, and instead of being grateful, you're going out of your way to destroy them. I would turn myself over to Snow to get Nero back and... God, enough. Clove said, lacking her usual bite. You're going to make yourself crazy trying to convince yourself you could have prevented this. I'll do it. Just shut up. I can't watch you fall into any more pieces. Not again. Felix managed a shaky laugh, giving her a smile. Don't do that either, she chastised. Your smile gives me the creeps. I've been told I have a rather captivating smile, Felix retorted. Clove rolled her eyes. It wouldn't seem like a nice smile to whoever said it if they ended up hurt every time they saw it. Fuck, that's true. Isn't it? He asked, frowning at that assessment. Yeah, we'll see. I'll do my part on one condition, she said, finally. Felix waited. You let me in on whatever the fuck you and my father have been working on the last 3 weeks. A depraved smirk lit up his face and he slung an arm around her shoulder. Bingo. Welcome back, H. Let's get to work. Underscore 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 alternate ending 10/12 underscore 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 October 75. As Harriet Welsh rounded the corner, bouncing on her toes with a smile spread across her face, she looked to him and said, "You're rather predictable, Soldier Wilder. I knew you'd be here if I took this route." "You mean you're lucky I'm here? Otherwise, who'd get you out of trouble if you were caught sneaking food?" he chastised. "Are you insinuating that I'm fat?" she asked him, jokingly. "Nah. I think you're rather cute, actually." She smirked. "Now you're suggesting fat people can't be cute. Well, I'd rather have a full stomach and carry extra weight than be the itty-bitty little fucker I used to be. They called me skin and bones, you know. But about 6 months before I left, things suddenly got better. With 2 victors at once, and for the second year in a row, the region thrived. Mom had enough money to go around and I finally stopped looking like some ugly motherfucker's scarecrow, he replied. Then, he added, so yes, people can be fat and be cute, not that you're fat. The doe-eyed girl studied him. Dicey was rugged, with reddish-brown hair long enough to hang around his face, but not entirely unmanageable. He was a bit on the short side, but still a good half-foot taller than herself, and was lean. Conventionally handsome he was not, but there was an unexpected kindness he radiated, and she was rather fascinated by it and its implications. He smiled at her unease. You can always call it quits. Harriet grinned, breaking out of her stupor and waving him off. Nonsense. A growing girl's gotta eat. Neither voiced that their routine had never actually been about food. Harriet found herself tempted to tell Dicey that his stance was all wrong, that a soldier should straighten their shoulders and maintain better posture. It was challenging to remember that that wasn't her responsibility anymore. He'd been the Capitol's man anyway, and she wondered to herself what the Capitol had said to him to entice him to begin with. Surely he knew what atrocities they'd committed before he'd joined. Then, again, he didn't look like he'd been enlisted long enough to see the Capitol's true colors. Your roommate still being a pain? Harriet shook her head. It's like sharing your room with a bitchy older sister, except your older sister is a slob who likes to leave her weapons laying on your bed. He laughed, thinking of Callan and feeling slightly nostalgic. Friend to friend, Harriet, don't sweat the small stuff. Cut her some slack and focus on yourself for now. There was a crinkle in her cheeks. We're friends. Dicey gave her a quirky grin, almost sad at how excited she seemed by the statement. I don't usually spend night after night with the same girl for nothing, firecracker. Yeah, we are friends. Aren't we? Her demeanor brightened at that revelation and she gave him a winning smile. Well, if we're friends then why don't you tell me something, Soldier Wilder? Dicey, he chided shortly, frowning. Soldier Dicey, yeah. Whatever. Harriet's voice softened and she asked, what made you change your mind about the Capitol, about wanting to be a part of the rebellion? For a moment, she thought he was going to go off on her, but he only said solemnly, I realized what I stood to lose if I didn't get out. What sucks is that I lost a lot just getting here anyway. Me too, Harriet thought. My turn, then. Since we're friends and all, Dicey repeated. How'd you finish school so early? My mother. Harriet paused, trying to frame her response in a palatable manner. She thought I had more important things to do than focus on something as petty as high school, so she accelerated my education and focused the remaining time on learning to interpret. How to interpret what? Harriet looked uncomfortable. All sorts of things I don't have the liberty to discuss. Sometimes I think that maybe if I had gone to a real high school, I'd have made my own set of friends. My mother's gone now and now it's just me, all on my own, and I don't feel ready yet. You're not alone. I happen to be very good company. Why oh why hadn't she been allowed to assimilate with normal 16-year-olds? She didn't know how to handle this. The dark-haired girl forced herself to assume a poker face, but noticed from the corner of her eye that he had the same flush across his cheeks. With a twinkle in her eyes, she walked beside him, and made a mental checklist. Focus, Harriet. He is just a boy. Just think of what mother would say if she saw you now. A resigned look crossed her face, and she said to herself again, get it together. He is just a boy. Just a boy like any other. Just, up. And that's when she went tumbling to the ground. Whoa, you okay? Dicey asked, immediately extending his hand to her. Harriet turned back to him. I guess that depends who you're asking, she said, with a mortified sigh. He only gave her a puzzled look in response, the concern growing deeper as she sat in place, unmoved from the concrete. Underscore 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 underscore. After recovering from that rather crippling episode of humiliation, Harriet went into the next day with little rest. Tell me you're not having another late night. Harriet leaned against the wall of her room, not saying anything. She burrowed into her pillows and let out a yawn. No, today would not be another late night. Several hours in a round-table discussion with Felix Gray, Balthazar Holloway, and the other members of the triad, one replacing her mother in a gut-wrenching fashion Harriet had not been prepared for, was enough to push her into a state of slumber once her back hit the mattress. She closed her eyes. "I was talking to you, sweet pea." Harriet roused from her sleep, pouting over the pillow that had been snatched from her very arms. "Not another late night, I promise. Just trying to sleep." "Good, because starting today, if you try to pull any more in and outs at Forum, I'll pull a Dre Holland and then use the remaining blood to give this room a new paint job. Have you ever thought of going to a listening doctor, Clove?" Harriet asked, seriously, blinking in her unrest. "Might help." Clove smirked, rather smug, and said, "I've always been an instant gratification sort of girl." "That much is apparent," Harriet mumbled, snatching her pillow back from Clove. Clove had the audacity to appear offended by her candor. "As long as we're clear," Clove said, intently. "Crystal," Harriet mocked. The two settled into their beds with Harriet letting out a sigh. Clove yanked the cord on the lamp and darkness found them both. Underscore 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 underscore. Where the hell was she? Every night they found each other in the same corner. This was her room, wasn't it? She'd said her room was furthest left and out of view. He hesitated, unsure of whether to take the initiative or whether he'd be an unwelcome bother in her presence. Dicey struck up the nerve and knocked lightly on the door. No response came. Worry knotted his stomach. What if something bad had happened to her? Harriet was such a flighty character it was hard to imagine her successfully pulling herself out of any dangerous situation that could find her. He knocked harder at the thought. This time the door opened. It took him a second to mask his horror. "It's pretty late," Dicey Clove lamented, blinking at the fluorescent, well-lit hallway in contrast to the blanket of darkness covering her own room. His stomach churned. It seemed in her delirious unrest Clove lacked the bite, considering their last interaction had consisted of her howling in fury when her father had told her Magnilda was with his mother, and his subsequent attempts to placate her by building Callan up as capable of protecting the entire household. The redhead nodded, trying to stave off tears. "I'm sorry, my timing's a mess. How are you holding up, Chloe?" "I'm okay," she said. Dicey tried to stop himself from becoming a blubbering wreck and provoke her ire. A heavy guilt washed over him as he thought of Nero's beaming smile, a one-off comment here and there. A few tears escaped him, and he wiped them away in a moment's notice. Instead, Clove pulled him into her arms, and gently rubbed his back. "I'm sorry," he pleaded. "I'm so fucking sorry, Clove." "I know," Clove replied. She nestled into the crook of his neck, and said more reassuringly, "I miss him, too." In the darkened corner of the room, he saw Harriet now. She stared at him, and he gave her a brief, grateful smile, failing this time to clear his tears. He turned his attention to Clove and said, "Are things ever going to get better?" "They will," Clove said, earnestly. "I have to believe with us all on the same side, with all of us being smarter, that we'll come through this, but it won't be easy. It'll be really fucking hard, before it gets better, but we will figure it out together." And though he felt a weight had been lifted, the auburn-haired man couldn't help but wonder how his mother was doing, how his brother and sister, and Clove's sister were doing. Maybe for a moment, he understood Clove's frustration. There was a restlessness he tried to combat, but for now, he'd appreciate their path forward and try to keep himself down to the ground. Underscore 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 underscore. "Oh, Cato," his stepmother said, delighted by his presence at their door. She pulled him into their unit. "It's about time you come to visit, sweetie." He sat on his brother's bunk bed and leaned back. "Been in training a lot. I didn't think this is how District 13 would unfold." "Well, we miss you," Sandra said, cheerfully. "The other day Oliver was telling your friend's little girl, Amoy's girl, about how his brother is the strongest man on earth. It was quite touching." He's becoming a little heartbreaker, that one. Kato smirked, slightly, laughing. Don't let Felix find out. He seems to vacillate between treating Brooke as a baby sister or his very own child, but either way, Lolly won't lead a very happy life if he does find out. Sandra's lips pursed in amusement as she ran a hand through her hair. Kato squinted his eyes at the roots of her hair with bewilderment. You're blonde, he said, in bewilderment. She asked. Yes, in the cleric's world, fair-haired women were considered easily swayed. I had no interest in playing to that stereotype, so this was my compromise. Oh, he said, frowning. He'd always thought the Elroy genes could overcome any adversity. Kato shook his head, annoyed at his ability to overanalyze any matter presenting itself to them. How is it going with your girlfriend, then? Sandra asked, bringing Hazel to him. He accepted the infant gratefully, placing her on the bed with him. Kato grinned as Hazel tried to bobble on over to him. Just as she nearly toppled over, he swooped her into his arms in a rather uncoordinated motion, and laughed gently, trying to calm the distraught infant down from her near fall. You're okay, Hazy. It's okay. I don't know, he shrugged, discouraged. She hasn't talked to me since I said all that stuff to her. Well, what exactly did you say? That I'm going to stand up as a man and protect my family and that I won't make any excuses, Kato remarked. I hope it sounded better the first time I said it. You weren't supposed to recite my advice verbatim, Kato, she said, tucking a loose hair of his. Sandra smiled at him. You're a little hopeless sometimes, honey. I would have said anything, Mom. Kato argued, embarrassed now that Sandra had made her point. She's pretty much the only thing keeping me breathing. At 18, everything seems like it's going to last forever. Just take a breath, Kato. You're still so young. I was narrowing in on 30 and thought I was going to spend the rest of my life alone, but... Then you met Dad in a bar, Kato replied. It wasn't that tasteless of an affair, Sandra chastised, lightly. He used to come and people watch, and when I realized he didn't actually drink, I grew scared he was picking up the drunk women, so I threatened to stand on top of the bar and expose his methods to the rest of the patrons. Kato started to laugh at her theatrics. I'm sure that went well. Her pearly white teeth clenched together in a smile. In fact, it did. He decided he'd rather Sandra watch than people watch. We used to spend a lot of time talking, but he had neglected to inform me in all that conversation that he was married. You can imagine my displeasure when he disappeared from the scene after I'd already become pregnant and I had to find out more about him via bar chat with some of the other quarry men. And you still wanted him? Kato asked. I wanted what was best for the baby, Sandra said. I could have done it alone, but it would have been a struggle. It was his turn to shoulder some of the responsibility. You're something else. A wistful expression crossed her face. So, this Clove girl, for you, she's the end of the road, right? Kato sighed, dramatic. More like every road leads to her. Perhaps it's better to start small, Sandra offered. Be the support system she needs. She is probably under a lot of pressure. Let her figure out what's important to her and I'm sure eventually she'll come to you. You think so? He asked, doubtfully. What if she decides I'm not what's important instead? Sandra shrugged. Well, I can tell you one thing, Kato. Pressuring her isn't going to win you any points, that's for sure. Kato leaned back in the bed, looking to his sister with a rather silly face. What about you, Hayes? What do you think I should do? His sister only giggled at him in response. Underscore 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 underscore. The command leader read off the names: Elroy, Exil, Adair. I won't work with him. Finnick's eyes darted to Kato and he frowned, offended. Why not? I've been training a hell of a lot longer than you, kid. I don't work with District 4 scum, Kato spat, acidly. Scared I'll make you look bad? Don't worry. I'll go easy, Finnick winked. Kato crossed his arms, giving Finnick no attention, and turned to their command leader. He goes or I do. Don't go on my account, Finnick replied, snorting. We'd really hate to lose the harmony and sense of leadership you bring to the team. The blonde's eyes narrowed and he struck Finnick so suddenly it took Dicey aback. Whoa, whoa. Calm down, see. He pulled Cato out of Finnick's line of fire and gave him a worried expression. Hey, are you alright? What's going on? Cato only brooded, muttering crossly, I don't want to work with District 4 scum. Dicey gave him a half-exasperated expression as he pulled him away from the commander and the rest of the men. Breathe, Cato. It's going to be okay. He trained Dylan Sanders. I don't want to be a unit with that smarmy son of a bitch, because when you work together here, you die together, and I'm certainly not willing to give my life for his. Fair enough, Dicey replied. Just try to keep a leash on your temper and talk to me, okay? This isn't the annex. There are loftier expenses than cash currency. Cato nodded. How many insurgencies does there have to be before we run out of time and out of money? We can't stay here forever. Dicey folded his arms, no kidding. I say if this one doesn't do, then we find our own way out. I'm in 100%. Don't be reckless, Dice. Reckless. Dicey teased, I'm not sure I know what you're implying. He gestured to the left and said equally derisively, speaking of a man with a plan, what do you think Felix Gray has up his sleeve these days? What do you think this angle is? Cato added, pursing his lips in contemplation. Inevitably, this is going to come crashing down on us. We're about to find out. Underscore 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 underscore. November, 75. Cato yawned, messing with his hair as he dragged himself out of bed. As he unlocked the door, he blinked, and yawned again. What time is it, Lo? Late? Early? I don't know. Does it matter? Clove responded, testily. He shook his head, still blinking, and gestured for her to enter the room he shared with Dicey. The redhead's bed remained unmade. I said anytime, any day. I meant that. He was grateful at the small smile that lit up Clove's face. She sat on Dicey's bed, pulling his sheets up around her and got comfortable. I can't stop overthinking things. I just need to better understand what's happening, but Fix only gives me bits and pieces. He keeps nudging me towards you, but I don't know what he thinks will come of that for him. Besides my imminent death. Cato replied, wiping the sleep from his eyes as he slipped back into his bed, parallel to Dicey beside him. I'm not mad. You're not? He inquired, flabbergasted. Well, I'm a little mad, but that's just because you left me out of everything. Clove said, vaguely frustrated. He looked to the ceiling for answers. I wish I knew the right thing to say, Clove, but you're right. I betrayed your trust and that was a coward's move. I can only make up for the past by being better in the present, so that's what I'll do. Clove sighed, so let's forget all of that and just focus on how we got here to begin with. I need to remember why this is worth the effort, so I don't know. Tell me the story of when you first realized you might like me. He grinned, sleepily. Back at the courtyard in 6th grade and you were yelling at me for being a shitty friend to Dicey and you were right, as always, but I was too much of a bitch to own up. And I don't know, I guess something happened, because you hugged me, and for the first time I really didn't want you to ever let go. Cato turned towards her, man, that sounds like a pansy-ass story. I used to be a contender. She fluffed the pillow underneath her. I was 14, back when we thought I could have been pregnant by gun. I don't know how, but you said everything right that day, and didn't ask any questions. Made me realize that if I ever did get pregnant that I wouldn't want it to be him, I'd want it to be you. The first time we tried to get together, back before the reapings, before we broke up, laying in your bed, that was when I was sure. She stirred slightly. Sure of what? Sure it was always going to be you, of course, Cato replied. Well, it was always going to be you anyway. No one else would put up with me. Clovey, do you think when this is all over we'll ever get back to that place? It took her a minute to respond. I don't know, she said truthfully. I hope so, Kato. He let out a small yawn and then replied, okay, as they fell asleep. Underscore 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 underscore. There was a collective nervousness. She, Dicey, and Kato were being transported out west among a mixed unit of Synergy rebels and those who'd immersed themselves among the capital as spies, such as the lieutenant. The lieutenant read off the command once again. District 6 is the hub of transport for the entirety of Panem. Through their efforts, needs and commodities are not only dispersed throughout the capital, but throughout the districts in whole. Our goal is to shut it down. Clove had a buzzing in her head. Why couldn't she remember anything about District 6? As she looked towards her father, a flash of adrenaline coursed through her skin and she stood undaunted as they exited the hovercraft. She hated to say it, but she was worried about Felix. The little rat was on a mission of his own that she wasn't entirely sure he could pull off. Though, once she thought about it, if anyone needed to be on that mission, then it needed to be him. The air in District 6 was musty, stale. It reminded her of 5 in that they both had been polluted beyond recognition. At least in 2 there'd been clean air. In 13, there was hardly any air at all. Closing her eyes for only a second, Clove memorized every pocket of her uniform and committed to memory the arrangement of her knives. Clasped in her right hand was a gun she'd have easily thrown to the wind had she had a choice. The Synergy rebels eyed her with wariness and she contemplated telling them off, but focused on other matters. It only took a few moments before peacekeepers from 6 lunged at several of the soldiers. The group dispersed instantly and she found a grisly peacekeeper before her very own eyes. She smirked, ready for an outlet when he leaped towards Kato instead. A faint smirk lit up the blonde's face as he knocked the peacekeeper down, twisting his arm, and decking him in the face. I'm guessing you were the bottom of the barrel, Kato taunted. His hands then snaked around the peacekeeper's throat and with a sharp gesture he broke the man's neck. Amateur, Kato shot, spitting blood. Clove gave him a satisfied expression, following after him into the sunset overhead. 6 had been prepared, informed, and that was apparent by the number of peacekeepers circling them. Various small fights broke out. She and Kato trailed past the encounters and towards the transportation center. From what Felix had drilled into her a dozen or so times, it was a half-mile stretch from where they'd been scheduled to land and where the real work was to commence. With Dicey and her father out of sight, Clove kept close to Kato in fear she'd be left in 6 without a way home, wherever home was. Only minutes later they found the headquarters of 6, so to speak, and Kato gave her a grim expression. This was what they'd been instructed to capture. It was a dreary, poorly lit brick infrastructure that should have been condemned years and years ago. They looked at each other, knowing they needed to split up to scan the area and secure the facility. Don't wait until the last second to call me, Kato instructed her. Clove nodded, taking in the facility as they pushed past the doors. Be careful. He gave her a smug smirk, what's the fun in that? They split up, with Kato tailing to the left, and Clove to the right. In this distance, she heard Dicey call back off. Her heart rate quickened and she dashed towards the sound of his voice. She came to a sudden stop when she saw that the man looming threateningly close to Dicey was their comrade, 21-year-old Isaiah Exel. What the hell are you doing? Clove growled, pulling him away and snatching a serrated knife from her pocket so swiftly he barely had time to blink. Isaiah's eyes narrowed lethally, this little bitch is still on the capital's side. Clove flashed a look to the redhead and he waved his arms in protest. No, that's not true. You're protecting that cowardly motherfucker. Don't play stupid, Wilder. She found the cowering man on the floor behind Dicey, shaking erratically, and gave him an impatient expression. Red, kill him and let's go. Dicey stood in place. He doesn't need to die. He's scared just like the rest of us. He doesn't want to be here, so why are we punishing him for doing his job? He's either with us or against us. Isaiah combated. The world doesn't work like that. Dicey snapped, a quaver of fear in his voice. I was with you all along, but I did what I had to protect my family, and it took so much of what I had to join the right side. You can't expect him to change his mind in a moment. Things don't work like that. People don't work like that. Isaiah closed in on him, too fucking bad. The capital wouldn't give him a chance, so why should we? Frustrated, Dicey screamed, because if we're no better than the enemies we fight, we become them. He stood shakily with pleading eyes, but Clove shook her head. We don't have time for this. Well, then you better be willing to kill me, Clove, because that's the only way you're getting him. On with it, Holloway. You want to prove you're not a liability. Here's your chance, Isaiah demanded. Not a thought went through her head as she cocked the gun towards Dicey. That wouldn't go over well, would it, Red? Hurt flashed across his face. She turned in an instant and shot Isaiah in the leg. He fell to the floor, letting out a string of expletives, and Dicey's amber eyes widened. He pulled the man from 6 behind him and Clove stood, a heavy breath in her chest. For the first time in her life, she'd been merciful. Perhaps for the last time, too. Either way, the transportation system was left unguarded and she had a job to do. She shuffled through her pockets for Felix's blueprints. As she boarded the train, she read over his instructions, drawings, and diagrams. She grimaced at the poorly drawn pictures, but pored over every detail and got to work on the electrical system. So this was what he'd written in that scraggly notebook nearly a year before on Victory Tower. How long had Felix planned this out? In the distance, she heard voices come forward, following by grunts, agonized screams, and various loud noises. Clove turned off various switches quickly, yanked out electrical wires that crackled, and flinched for a moment, fearful of the consequences. Right as she was about to snap the last of the colored wires, she heard her name in the distance. She darted up instantly and ran towards the sound of Cato's voice. He'd always been too proud to ask for help, and, Clove sped up, pushing herself forward without a second breath. Clove. I'm coming, she screamed back. As Cato came into sight, her heart nearly stopped. Dicey laid on the floor, shaking, with Cato over him, trying to pick him up. The man from 6 was gone. Is he okay? Dicey breathed, his teeth chattering together. Probably abandoned you the moment he figured out you couldn't help him, Clove said, bitterly. I'd take some chocolate now, he replied, shakily. You hate chocolate, Clove remarked. Must have overworked yourself, Cato agreed. It'll help, Dicey argued, irritably. Cato scooped him up like a rag doll. Sorry, princess. Fresh out. Clove watched warily as Dicey blinked slowly, succumbing to rest. What happened, Dicey? Are you hurt? Dicey didn't reply, so Clove shook him. He remained still. Dicey, focus, she snapped. Cato gave her a nervous look and shook his petite frame. A second time, Cato shook him harder, smacking him across the head. Dice, wake up. When the redhead didn't stir, Cato's words grew unsteady. Something's wrong, Clove. His breathing became irregular and unmanageable as he stared at the redhead's lean form. Don't panic, Clove advised, though she wasn't any calmer than he was. Cato stumbled to his feet, running out of the transport center, and into the darkness. He must have passed 3 or 4 viable medics in his haziness, speeding towards the hovercraft. Clove followed on his tail. As they tumbled into the hovercraft, Cato barked to the awaiting medic, fix him, and fix him now. He dropped Dicey to floor and the pair remained at his side while the medic worked to diagnose his condition. Details, boy. Details. I found him on the floor, out of breath, shaking like madness, and I told him to suck it up, but something was wrong. We can't wake him up, no matter how hard we hit him. Which was hopefully not that hard, the medic admonished. Cato glared at the older gentleman, who took Dicey's pulse. As he scanned over the redhead, he looked back to the morose pair. He's fallen comatose. No. He doesn't have any traumatic brain injuries. We checked. Clove cried out. There was a sharp cluck and the medic continued to look over the sweating 18-year-old boy. Cato's eyes were rimmed a panicked red, while Clove's face contorted painfully and she longed to screech out in response, but there was nothing to be said. It was supposed to end with Nero, and now. Underscore 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 underscore. Callan, Hallie, and Magnilda stared at one another, each hesitating to be the first to make a move. "It's not my house," Magnilda piped up. "You're it. You're it." Callan and Hallie yelled at each other immediately after. At a second stalemate, they looked at one another, and then the basement door. Miss Wilder gestured for the children to stay back as she stood up. "I'll deal with this," she said stubbornly, beginning to ascend the stairs and exit the basement. "Mom, don't." Hallie pleaded. "Those men have taken all they can. They won't take this home," the auburn-haired woman replied resolutely. Callan stood on his feet. "Ma, wait." Miss Wilder turned back to her younger son and shook her head, firm. "Stay here, Callan. Not a chance. I won't let them take you." She slammed the door in his face, and just as he was going to huff out another retort, something heavy hit the door. His eyes flashed with confusion and he prodded with the door until he realized that she had blocked the exit. "Ma," he screamed, "Ma, don't do this. Ma." Magnilda and Hallie were on their feet in an instant, pushing against the weight as much as they could muster, but failed to break the fold. "Ma!" Callan screamed, anguish etched all over his face. "Mom, let us out. Mom!" Hallie called out. She shook the door, unable to make any progress. The trio worked against the door for several minutes as they heard Miss Wilder's painful screams. Finally, a gunshot went off, and Callan screeched out higher. He collapsed against the stairs, sobbing. Magnilda stood, stunned. The door boomed open after a minute and Hallie shifted in position. Miss Wilder called out faintly, "Babies, are you okay?" Hallie thrust herself into her mother's arms as the basement door opened. "Mama." Magnilda wiped the tears from her cheeks and ran past the affectionate pair. At the head of the stairs were the corpses of two peacekeepers, one with a bullet embedded in the back of his head and the other with a protruding hole in his chest from where Dice's old spear had made impact. Relief washed over the 14-year-old girl, before several questions subsequently bubbled to the surface. Underscore 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 underscore. He finally had the man cornered. Similarly to when he'd first been assigned years earlier, this moment was private, raw. The goal was simple: using the information from the first insurgency, they'd take hold of Snow, and finally make him accountable for his actions. Right now, it wasn't going so well. President Snow had the same narrow eyes, snake-like and surprisingly vicious. "Mr. Gray, I should have expected no less," he said, calmly. "They'd been a fool to underestimate you those years ago, but I, young man, never was so blind." Felix tried to stop himself from reacting suddenly, and said stonily, "You've always been a brilliant leader, sir." President Snow's lips pursed in a smug satisfaction. "Were you displeased by the condition of my offer? Well, we can amend it, of course. More disposable income for you and your family, more supplies for your growing talent." They were impressed in the markets, and of course, immunity. The 19-year-old froze. "Ah, yes. Terms are always negotiable, you simply must know what to ask for." "I've only ever wanted one thing," Felix replied, doubtfully. The president smirked eerily. "Well, let's see what we can do for you." Underscore 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 underscore. Cato and Clove didn't dare leave Dice's side even after he'd been secured in a bed back in 13. The hospital was sterile and claustrophobic, but they didn't want to think of what could happen the moment they stopped demanding only the best care for their closest confidant and friend. Eventually, they were dragged away by their fathers. Lieutenant Holloway and Mr. Elroy nudged them down the narrow hallway. Cato's father had at least tried to be affectionate, brushing his son's hair back with his fingers, and rubbing his shoulder reassuringly. "We'll monitor this carefully." Lieutenant Holloway had only told his daughter that her friend would endure as they'd all learned to. Once their children were out of sight, the two men discussed what was to come next. While Mr. Elroy wasn't a military command, nor a leader in an official capacity, he was slightly more tactful than the 40-year-old lieutenant he'd come to view as a friend. They waited for the other mobilized unit to return home, hoping against hope that in the morning they could claim a victory. Underscore 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 underscore. It was only weeks ago that he and Clove had laid in separate beds and discussed the past, then distantly of the future. Now all he could think of was the present, of Dicey, of his sister's worsening health, of his mother back in two, and whether they'd come for her following his abandonment of Golden Valley. Clove had collapsed in his arms. He had sat helplessly as she cried into his shirt. They'd never equipped him for crisis, for attachments this deep, for moments that felt like they ticked on endlessly. The blonde didn't notice the tears rolling down his own cheek until Clove looked up and wiped them away, before burying herself in the crook of his neck. "They can't take him from us," he said, determined. "I marked him, that makes him mine, and he can't die until I say so." Clove withdrew from his neck and grasped his face with her palms. "We'll make it through this. We always have. No matter what. Right, Cato?" He nodded hesitantly. "I can't spend another night knowing I didn't show you much you've meant to me, Cato. I'm ready, and if you'll have me, if you're ready, I want to give you all that I am." A heart-wrenching sense of understanding crossed his face and he leaned into her, caressing her lips with his passionately. He closed his eyes, deepening the kiss as he ran a hand through Clove's long locks. He ran his hands along the edge of her shirt, tugging at it gently, and she nodded. He then removed his own shirt, capturing her in another kiss. She wiped another tear streak from his face, wrapping her arms gently around his neck. Clove didn't bother to try to tell him how to remove her pants. There were so many pockets, patches, and mishaps that she removed them herself, remaining only in her undergarments. Cato traced the developing bruises from the battle gingerly and laid kisses down her figure, absorbing himself in the task. He heard a gasp as he removed her bra and supported her breasts with palms of his hands. Cato continued to learn the contours of her body, before pulling her last article of clothing away. Clove was a sight to behold. Though dusted in an impossibly high number of scars, and several developing bruises, she wore them as a badge of honor. "Wow, Clovey," he murmured, transfixed. His hands found their way back to her waist and she pushed him off slightly. Cato looked up, confused. "We can stop any." Clove interrupted his babbling and leaned in for another kiss. "I want to give myself to you wholly. Do you trust me?" And there wasn't a doubt in his mind, but he couldn't help but to feel anxious at the way she eyed his pants. Finally, he pried them off, and got closer to her level. Similarly to the last time they'd been in this position, her hand brushed against his length. This time, however, she pulled his boxers off halfway and worked faster. There was less hesitance on behalf of both parties as they became infatuated with each other on the most intimate level. He leaned his head back, enjoying her ministrations when warmth surrounded him. Cato's eyes nearly rolled to back of his head, surprised at the new development, but not at all displeased. She was rather good at that, too, he thought. He let out several guttural grunts as she continued to tackle every contour of his shaft. After several minutes of losing himself to her, Cato forced himself to stop her. A cocky smirk lit up his face at the disappointment on her face. She wouldn't be disappointed for long. His rough hands plunged into the most intimate part of her body, becoming accustomed to her. Learning from their last encounter, he changed gears, and used his hands in just a manner to leave Clove a string of moans. While she was distracted, he lowered himself, and his tongue darted into her, exploring her curiously. While he could have sped up, made her scream his name, and he planned to someday, if she let him, the blonde resigned himself to returning her love tenfold. They could fuck in the future. Tonight was so much more than that. Once she hit her peak, he had a hard time hiding the smugness written all over his face. That was, wow, Cato. Clove ran a hand across his muscular chest and leaned against him innocently, wrapping her arms around him. He hugged her back just as firmly, fearful to ever let go. But, he didn't cry, and that was a step up from the last 6 hours. Clove looked to him seriously, "Are you sure?" And there could have been a million reasons to retreat, to remove himself from this encounter, but Cato Elroy knew one thing, and that was that he was ready. He could give himself to Clove just as much as she had given herself to him, and a small pride surged through him. He gave her a confident smirk, laying back on the sheets. Taking her hand, he pulled her on top of him. "It's in your hands now, Clovey." And she gave him a tender smile, looking equally as proud as he did as she positioned herself on top of him. As he filled her, both let out equally loud groans. She took his hands in hers and whispered softly, "We can stop anytime." "But not yet, right?" he asked as another surge of pleasure rocketed throughout his body. At this point, Clove began bouncing up and down, and Cato had to actively fixate his thoughts on not falling short of her expectations. Soon enough, he began to meet her movements with equally passionate thrusts. She let out an erotic moan a few pitches too loud that perfectly summarized his own feelings. His only previous experience had been rooted in terror, and every jolt of pleasure he'd felt then had been laced with disgust, self-loathing, and agony. He'd nearly broken into a sob then, and though he felt self-conscious now as he wanted to cry again, Cato was self-aware enough to realize that despite the intensity of this moment, his feelings were pure. Cato felt a lot of things, but remorse wasn't one of them. As they met again for another thrust, Clove let out another moan, and he grabbed onto her to her breasts, playing with them as she led him in their movements. With the sultry look on her face, Cato thought he could go on for days. There was magic, a splendor that he wanted to catch hold of. Several more minutes passed as she kissed him, running a hand through his hair, and asked how he was doing. He was barely able to muster the focus to mutter faster as she bounced on top of him. Finally, the two got close, their breathing accelerating more and more out of control. He sped up, lasting only a few more seconds. She wiped the tears from his eyes, and he kissed her once more, before they came crashing down together. When they came back down from their high, Clove only panted, "Fuck." The blonde was hardly able to resist waggling his eyebrows with a suggestive laugh, "We just did." She gave him an assessing look in which he lifted his hands in mock surrender. "It was a joke, Clovey," he informed her with her purposefully innocent smile. Clove withdrew from him, sliding up his chest. "We did it," she whispered. He kissed her again, beaming. "Yeah, we did." She leaned against his chest and Cato brushed his lips against her forehead. "I love you." Moments passed and he added, "Thank you, Clovey." "For the sex?" she asked sleepily. Cato snorted, suppressing the obvious retort that he could have done so with anyone. Instead, he rubbed her cheek gently. "For being my rock, my best friend, partner in crime, the best thing that ever happened to me, for being you, for being Clove, the greatest experience of love in my life." And as tears amassed in the corner of her eyes, he added with a wink, "It helps that you have a nice ass." As if his words were not enough to go off of, he groped her for a moment, and kissed the crook of her neck. He then withdrew with a smirk, teasing, "All right, I'm done now." He wiped the tears from her cheeks gently. "Well, it's good to know you think so, since you started our first relationship on the high note of you're not sexy, but I like you anyways. Bet you're eating those words now, jerk." Cato covered his mouth as he began to laugh. She moved off of his chest and snuggled in beside him. He clung to her tightly, not daring to ever let go, and only said, "I've been doing that since the day I met you, Clove." Underscore 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 underscore. In the night, neither were haunted by the horrors they'd witnessed over 12 years in the training system. Not everyone found solace that night, however. Felix Gray had succeeded in his mission, but something felt twisted up inside. He'd almost accepted the man's offer, had been tempted by the snake, and that left a pit in his stomach. Once he'd come back down to earth, thinking of Nero, of his friends, of his sister, and Roxanne, Felix had recoiled in an instant. It had been too easy, and as he'd long recited, the prime of life is the worst place to be because it's highest point from which to fall. The moment they left the hovercraft, he escorted Harriet to the room she shared with Clove, muttering improprieties about the next step in their plan, before the 16-year-old apologized for shortchanging him. He waved her off, thinking to himself that at least she wasn't as bad as Johanna was. His last stop before bed was the Elroy compound. The patriarch answered the door, inquiring as to the state of affairs, and Felix only murmured that they'd won. Mr. Elroy gave him a congratulatory pat on the back, before taking him to retrieve Brooke from Oliver's bed. Felix didn't have the energy to ask why little Elroy was so close to Brooke, deciding it was tomorrow's problem, before scooping her into his arms. She blinked sleepily in response as he shifted her weight against him. The little angel was dressed warmer than he'd been, and he made sure to add that to his list of complaints about 13, before kissing the crown of her head. "Are you tired, too, Daddy?" she inquired with a yawn. His heart took a nosedive at the address. While he'd have done almost anything to keep Brooke safe, he didn't want to assume a role that wasn't his to take. It didn't help that it only reminded him of Srafina, and how she'd been without her 4-year-old for nearly 6 months now. For what little he did know about children, he was terrified of reuniting the little one with her mother, and Brooke being unable to recognize the woman who'd endured countless beatings to keep her well cared for. "Just Felix, he said in a delirious sleepiness as he unlocked the door to their room. Felix placed her in the bed, pulling the sheets up around her, and then returned his own bed, doing the same for himself. Underscore 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 underscore. As he watched Clove's chest rise and fall, he was overtaken by what they'd done the night before. A perverted grin lit up his face and he congratulated himself silently, before giving Clove a sweet kiss to the forehead. Cato played with her hair distractedly, trying not to let thoughts of concern for the redhead overwhelm him all at once. After a few minutes, Clove opened her eyes and gave him a tired smile. "What are you doing?" "Just appreciating what I have," he replied candidly. Her hazel eyes darted to the clock and she moved out of the comfort of bed to begin pulling on some of her clothing. Cato watched in mild amusement as Clove tried to organize her attire as to look the way it did the day before. And there was a sudden clarity, she was radiant. Taking a deep breath, he took Clove's hand in his own, and she gave him a bemused smile. She gave him a friendly squeeze back. "Clove Holloway, will you marry me?" Clove recoiled, instantly breaking contact. Her eyes widened as she looked from side to side. Before Cato could say anything else, she darted out of his room half naked. Underscore 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 alternate ending 11/12 underscore 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 November 75. The moment her bare legs hit the circulating air, Clove knew running had been a bad idea. Hindsight was 20/20, right? She was half naked, dressed only in her uniform top and underwear, and the path from Cato's room to her own wasn't one she'd fully mastered yet. She darted down one hallway on her tiptoes, ready to hook a left and find herself home free when she saw the morning soldier patrolling down the hallway, his rifle arched against his right shoulder. Clove couldn't remember his name, but she remembered enough about him to know that if he caught her, she'd never live this down. Clove scampered down a separate path, hitting the back wall of the bunker she shared with Harriet. She peered to the left and saw a mass of soldiers rising for the day. Even if the door was unlocked, she'd never make it around the corner without being seen by at least one of them. The 17-year-old groaned, hitting her forehead against the wall. Once her head made impact with the wall, it made a harsh sound. Clove bolted up on instinct. She could knock. Harriet's bed was in the right-hand corner of their room. She knocked on the wall, hoping the former victor's daughter would rise and come to her aid. 30 seconds passed and nothing happened. Clove groaned, hitting the wall again. Impatiently, she knocked on the wall 4 or 5 times until a sleep-deprived Harriet unlocked the door. When she saw nobody standing there, she rubbed the sleep from her eyes, and turned back to close the door. "Scariot!" Clove whispered loudly. Harriet blinked, turning from side to side, and yawning. "Scariot!" Clove repeated louder. Harriet stared at her, dazed. "A little help?" Clove demanded, sticking out one of her legs and pulling it away. Harriet gave her an intensely confused look before dragging the blanket off of her bed and running to Clove. Draping it over her, Harriet yanked Clove into their room. Once she was home free, Clove slouched on the bed. "Where the hell are your pants?" "Long story," Clove muttered. "I can see that," Harriet replied, stifling another yawn. "My former threat still stands, sweet pea. I will coat the walls in your blood if you don't keep this to yourself." Harriet raised her hands in surrender. "All right, whatever. Just so you know, Felix succeeded. President Snow has been contained. Go team, go." Harriet was almost touched by the concern that dotted Clove's words. "Is Fix okay? They've asked him to be Snow's executioner. Now that's something I want to see. Never seen a kill of his I didn't like, you know. One of his only redeeming qualities." "I say," Clove cheered up considerably, "who says no news is good news?" Harriet shook her head in exasperation, and stole her blanket back, huffing, "I'm going back to bed." "Don't rip the skin from my bones, Scariot," Clove retorted, throwing a pillow at her roommate. She pulled on a pair of sleeping pants from the drawer, and returned to her bed, snuggling beneath the sheets. Underscore 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 underscore. Cato entered the sterile hospital room, relieved to find Clove was nowhere in sight. Sandra had warned him not to pressure her, and of fucking course, he had to ruin everything. Clove was going to hate him. They'd just gotten on the right track and now he'd ruined everything. He sat in a chair beside Dice's bed, reading the board containing his personal information: born 5-13-57, 5'7", 137 pounds, and blood type, the only and he'd ever have, Cato mused, 6% body fat, no known allergens. Cato peered at Dicey. He looked so peaceful Cato would have mistaken him for sleeping if the true context hadn't been so sinister. The blonde tucked some of the redhead's stray locks back. He couldn't remember the last thing Dicey had said to him before they left. Something stupid, pointless probably, maybe a joke, an unfunny one, most likely. A selfish streak ran through him. Dicey couldn't just die. He needed him, for a lot of things, but especially for help with reading Clove. "What the fuck, princess? If you needed help, you were supposed to tell me. I would have come right away. You have to know that," he murmured softly. A groan left Dice's mouth. Cato continued to rant, "Dice, I already lost one brother, I can't lose another, can't lose anyone else I love." He tried to stop himself from breaking the machines in a rage. "You didn't even hear the best part. I asked Clove to be mine forever and asked her to marry you." Dicey asked sleepily, his eyes heavy with fatigue as they fluttered open slowly. Cato stopped. "Well, yeah." The redhead tried to focus his vision. "I hope that fuck was worth everything you're going to be paying with if she said yes." Cato looked at him, confused. "Or did you not even get that far?" Cato remained rigid. Dicey didn't react any better to his silence. "What the hell made you think proposing could possibly be a good idea? Have you looked around lately? We're in the middle of hell and now you want to add the stress of a teen marriage to this hot mess. Use your head, moron." And before Cato could think of his next hot comeback, his brain processed everything, and he grabbed the redhead into tight hug. "You. What the hell, Dicey?" Dicey's stern expression softened. "Don't cry, see. I'm sure you and Clove will work everything out. It's kind of your thing, ain't it? Cato shook his head, retaliating through blurry tears. You were in a coma, you stupid son of a bitch. Dicey blinked, still having difficulty focusing. I was, he asked, and then looked to the board. Glucagon. Explains why I feel so crummy. Oh, Dicey agreed tiredly, a diabetic coma. Been a while since I had one of those. What? The blonde sputtered angrily. If my blood sugar dips too low, I get a little woozy, can't see as well, might become a little shaky. Usually better within an hour or two. Dicey shrugged, yawning. Cato gave him a nasty look. I thought you were dying, you stupid motherfucker. That's karma. Dicey shot, unsympathetically, and turned away, rebuffing him. A low growl came from the blonde's mouth, and he said through grit teeth, since when are you diabetic? Since I was born, I think, Dicey said, perplexed. There's a couple different types of diabetes. I got the irreversible one. Cato's pitch went up a few octaves, and you never thought it'd be important for me to know that. How many years have we been friends, Dice? Cato, calm down. I love you too, all right. I'm fine. I won't be pulling a Nero, promise, he said, failing to quell the guilt in his chest. If you're still that worried, feel free to give me a share of your color-coated chocolate. Cato backed away, brushing him off, and shot back, I'm not that concerned, Dice. I'm sure you'll heal up just fine, actually. The redhead laughed, and then looked at him, groaning, so, about you and Clove. Underscore 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 underscore. In her brief respite, Clove snuggled against the sheets. Even if she hadn't been given the leave of absence, she'd have made up some excuse anyway. Anything to avoid Cato. What the hell had he been thinking? She couldn't get married. The 17-year-old could barely make it through a 30-second conversation without making some inappropriate comment. If she got married, people would probably expect her to act like a fully functioning adult and consider someone else's feelings for once. Hell, if she was going to start doing that. What the hell do I do? And in Nero's voice, she heard the simple reply. You do whatever will make you the most happy, Clove. Oh, I'm going crazy. Clove pulled at her hair. What if I screw everything up and end up as a teenage divorcee with some pipsqueak I don't want, and... Screw everything up how? Well, let's say I say something that makes Cato mad or hurts his feelings. Then you say sorry. It's not that easy, Nero. She could almost hear his snort, the indignant retort. Let's be real. Cato isn't with you for your sunny personality. He's got thicker skin than you think, and it speaks pretty lowly of you to underestimate him. No, he doesn't. The first time we broke up was because I told him he was annoying me. Well, yeah, Clove. Duh. Who'd stay in a relationship where their partner says they're a bother? That's basic logic, really. Clove huffed. I'm not marriage material, Nero. Not everyone is domesticated like your bride was. True enough, but then tell him that. If you're going to make a decision, you have to be able to stand by it. But, Let's look at this from a different angle for a minute, alright? You and Cato clearly love each other, but do you really think you're in it for the long run? Well, yeah. We've fought so incredibly hard for each other. It's Cato from sunrise to sunset and every hour in between. He's my every best memory and the only thing that keeps me from spiraling into madness most of the time. And presumably you want to spend the rest of your life with him, then, right? I always hoped so. I didn't need a happily ever after. I just need him. Then what is a piece of a paper, really? It doesn't change you. Your marriage is up to you. Your relationship is your decision. I kept telling Aniston we'd tie the knot the moment the war was over, and man, I wish I hadn't waited so long. I kept thinking I had all the time in the world, but I didn't. You don't, he doesn't. Enjoy each other, whether you get married or not, but don't get stuck in the same circular line of reasoning, and fall apart. She froze, digesting the information, and huffed out in frustration, "What the hell do I do?" "You do whatever it takes to make it right in your mind. Underscore 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 underscore. Good to hear you're doing better, Dicey. You scared a lot of people, Harriet said with a cheery smile as she entered his hospital room. Felix knit his brows at the exchange. Dicey gave her a tired smile. "Not Soldier Wilder anymore." Harriet stumbled on her words. "I'm sorry. I..." Dicey grabbed her hand. "It was a joke, firecracker." He let go and Harriet eyed her hand for a moment, his touch still lingering. "Thanks for coming. It's nice of you. Clove hasn't even managed that much. How do you two know each other?" Felix balked finally. "We're friends," Dicey told him, and then looked to Harriet. "You know Felix? I mean, I knew you were a Synergy rebel, but how'd you end up in the combat unit?" Felix gave him an even more baffled look. "Dicey, what the fuck are you talking about? The half-pint is Lime Welsh's daughter, or have you never watched 3 seconds of television before?" When he fully realized what was happening, he smirked at the look on Dicey's face, adding, "But I guess she'd be a pretty shitty body language interpreter if she gave away trade secrets." "Felix, fuck off," Dicey said, impressively flat-affected. "Oh, whatever. Don't throw a fit," Felix said, rolling his eyes as he headed towards the door. "I'll be back to check in on you later. Try not to die while I'm gone." After Felix closed the door behind him, Harriet became rigid. "Oh, that definitely was not a good look. I'm giving you 3 seconds to explain, and if I find out you were using me for information, you won't even live that long," Dicey remarked, icily. "I didn't even know you were someone to obtain information from. It was just nice to have a companion, Soldier Wilder." So that was how she was going to play it. Fine with him. Dicey gave her a dirty look. "I knew there was something up with you from the moment I first saw you, but I took a chance." "Don't feed me bullshit." The wavy-haired brunette remained stoic. "Is it so hard to believe I wanted a friend? I have feelings, being a body language interpreter doesn't change that." He racked his brain for where he'd seen her before. "You're the under-21 commander," Dicey realized, thinking back to when he'd been a capital soldier protecting some pitiful governmental official. "Oh, fuck, how could I've been so stupid as to let you use me?" "No!" Harriet shouted, and leaned into his chest, giving him a kiss, her first kiss, a rather sloppy, haphazard kiss. He pulled away harshly, pushing her off of him, and she looked away, flushed. "I'm sorry, It might surprise you to find I'm not that easy," Dicey growled angrily, pushing her back into the seat beside him. "Talk." She looked awfully small as she explained. "I like you a lot and obviously I misread a lot because I had really hoped." "Never mind, forget it. All you need to know is that I'm not very good at this." He balled his hands in frustration. "Well, what good is me liking you? None of this was real. You were playing me." Harriet looked wrecked by his distrust. "No one has ever liked me for just being me, but you did. You were willing to be my friend when no one else was, and by the time I realized who you were, I couldn't risk losing your friendship. It would have crushed me. I've never had friends, Dicey, only subordinates and commanders, and..." She looked ready to cry. "Newsflash, I'm not a good person, Harriet. I'm not a nice guy, not someone you should like. You have no idea what I've done, what I've seen. You're just a child." Her eyes turned to slits, surprising him at the capacity. "I am not a fucking child. I wish everyone would stop treating me like I am. Do you know how cheap life gets when you're trained to read lies? People know this, and yet they continue to lie to you anyways. I've heard some pretty horrible stories, but I keep my head up, and try to work through it. That doesn't make me a child." Anger rose in Dicey's chest. "You want horrible stories? When I was your age, I got a girl pregnant, and when she told me, I told her to take an herbal mix or do whatever she had to get rid of it. I begged her to deal with it, but she refused, so I took matters into my own hands." His fists shook. I planned it so perfectly, too, made Ashley think I was going to offer her my hand in marriage, and then when we were alone and she smiled at me reluctantly, I slammed her to the ground, and gutted her stomach until she was unrecognizable, and you want to know the best part? She'd actually thought I'd come around, but no, I hadn't, because I'm not a good person. Don't tell me you like me, because you don't know the things I've done. I'm sorry you had to do that. Dicey was confused, didn't understand what was happening, shaking in a sensory overload. No, Harriet, I'm not a good guy. I'm dangerous, so why the hell would you think it's a good idea to like me? I'm not, He couldn't catch a breath, the panic rising in his chest. Can't breathe. Sobs racked his frame and Harriet pulled him towards her, awkwardly trying to comfort him. This is all so fucked up, Dicey coughed, trying to regain his coherency. Ashley's the one who's dead, and the baby, and you're pitying me. Don't make me the victim, because I'm not. And she thought of what her mother often told soldiers, finding it oddly befitting for the situation. You are not your past, or at least you don't have to be. She laid him back in the bed, steadying him, and brushed her fingers across his shoulder. Don't underestimate your power to change things. You're stronger than you know. You showed mercy to the conductor from 6 because you wanted to fight on your own terms. Doesn't change anything. I'm still a bastard. Harriet gave him a morose smile. Maybe, but at least you're self-aware. Harriet, he began, reluctantly, we can't do this. I don't want to hurt you. I don't want to hurt anyone else. She put her hands behind her head, reminding him strikingly of Felix. Not now, of course, she agreed. A romantic pursuit could hinder your opportunity to work through what you've endured, Dicey. You may need a listening doctor. She laughed, bitterly, I know I do. He watched her with interest. My mother died in the same battle that claimed your friend, Harriet said. And I convinced myself that was a good thing, that without her telling me what to do, I could be whoever I wanted. None of us are immune for cruelty. I don't understand. You were an experiment, she said, finally. I don't mean it to sound callous in telling you this, but you were the first person I could imprint another persona onto. You were a fresh start. I don't even know who I am now. I have no identity, Dicey. I'm a vessel. I don't know if I am capable of developing meaningful relationships, because I don't. What if this is real? Harriet. So, yes, I'm sure you've done terrible things, she said, stonily, but let's not pretend that I haven't sent hundreds to their death. I was responsible, then, as I am responsible for hurting you now. Part of him was hurt by the way she spoke, because it was so unlike her, the her he knew, at least. Knowing the truth added a dimension of depth to her, sure, but it still stung. Damn if he didn't like her still, despite that. Now it was his turn to find out what was real. Underscore 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 underscore. This food looks like animal droppings, Felix complained as they processed through the line. He nudged Brooke forward as she stood, trying to figure out what she wanted. It all sucks, be it. All sucks. Dicey nodded in grim agreement. No wonder I ended up hypoglycemic. No, you ended up hypoglycemic because you neglected to inform any of us that you have diabetes, and then ran off trying to save some semiconductor from Exil, Cato corrected impishly, flicking his head. Felix gave him a wide grin. I would have shot Exil in a heartbeat, given the chance. He's been such a stiff since we first met, fresh off the truck in 2 North. The redhead stifled a laugh. Pretty sure he's going to tear out my spleen whenever he sees me next. He didn't like me much to begin with. Well, then it's a good thing you don't need it to live. Although I wouldn't say the same about your spine if you ever pull something that risky ever again, Cato threatened. Felix continued to nudge Brooke forward, and she turned to him, placing her hands on her hips defiantly. He gave her a warning glance, daring her to act out, and she pouted. He ignored her. So. He knew, didn't he? Dicey took pause as Cato and Felix both watched him. Yes, he gave them both a look before they interrupted him. But only because he caught me with my insulin back in 2nd grade. It had to be the son of a fucking nurse, too. I threatened to stab him in the throat, but I don't know why I bothered. He worried about me constantly after that and I couldn't get him to leave me the fuck alone. I made fun of him in hopes he'd back off. Course that didn't go so well, because then I caught the wrong end of one your right hooks. Dicey finished, shoot a dirty look at Felix. Felix shrugged. Dicey, they heard in the distance, and then were overrun as Clove sped past them and pulled the redhead into an embrace. Tears streaked down her cheeks, and Dicey looked down, confused. Hey, Chloe, he said, perplexed, as he rubbed his hair. She gave him a vicious glare, repeating, hey, Chloe. Felix looked utterly entertained, snorting, oh, was I supposed to inform H that you weren't dead? My bad. You're an asshole, Clove informed Felix, her voice muffled by Dicey's shirt. The redhead gave her a bemused smile, petting her hair for a moment, and holding her. Warmth spread throughout his chest. This is touching, Chloe. Really? She shoved him off, huffing. Well, I thought you were dying. What the fuck happened to you, Red? And leave you three alone to rip out each other's throats in Oberia Jamison style? Hardly. Princess happens to be a diabetic, actually, Cato informed her. Naturally, he thought the best course of action was not to tell anyone. Clove's eyes met Cato's for a moment, before she looked to Dicey. That is generally something you share with your unit when you're at war, Dicey, or at least with your commander. I did, Dicey replied. The lieutenant has known since the day I arrived at the military base. This only irritated her more and she pushed him away angrily. Her glance then softened as she looked to Cato, and replied very clearly, yes. Huh, he asked, and mistakenly handed her a cup of fruit he'd been holding. She gave him a strange look. I said, yes, Clove repeated. Cato still looked dumbfounded. Dicey smacked the side of his head, yes, she'll marry you, idiot. Don't be so dense. Cato's eyes dilated and he stuttered excitedly, nervously, yes, you'll marry me. Felix opened his mouth and Dicey slammed his hand over it in an instant, daring the 19-year-old to ruin the moment. Yes, I'll marry you, Clove acknowledged self-consciously with a nod. And there it was, his boyish smile, the smile that made everything worth it. She gave him a shy smile, not bothering to remark that there were several stipulations to her accepting his offer. Cato turned to Dicey, grabbing his hands, and jumping up and down. I'm getting married. Clove let out a dry sigh. So much for not attracting attention. Dicey joined in on Cato's jump, and added in a saccharine, sarcastic tone, usually getting married at 18 is a bad thing, but whatever. You're getting married. Felix started laughing hysterically, mocking Clove. Holy fuck, this is a train wreck, H. Brooke ran up to Clove, innocent eyes opened wide. Miss Clove, can I come to your wedding? Felix continued to laugh, holding his stomach. Clove pat her head for a moment, might as well, since it's not exactly a secret anymore. She couldn't help to smile in return. They could make it work, right? They weren't perfect and they sure had a lot to learn, but at least they'd learn together. Hey! Clove complained after a minute, swatting Dicey away, and leaning on her tiptoes. Cato laughed, bending down, his lips meeting hers. Worth it, worth it, worth it, her brain rung out. This is going to be great, Cato beamed at her. She gave him a smirk, challenging, with you it's bound to be. Underscore 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 underscore. December, 75. Are you nervous? Too late to doubt my decision. Felix asked honestly, pacing around. He looked to Harriet, he'll be my 100th. Harriet fixed his coat, nice, even number. A good place to stop. Felix looked to her, what scares you? Harriet took in a breath, hesitating, not knowing what to do next, being unable to rein in my temper, and being ostracized from the world. And if we're getting real specific, rat mutations with big teeth. You're lucky, that's all. Hopefully when this is all over, your fears will be that small too. Handing him the trusty warhammer, the 16-year-old looked him dead in the eye. You are better than him. Don't lose yourself. He took a breath, repeating the statement to himself. Thanks, Hillary. It's Harriet, she chided. Couldn't care less if I tried, Felix teased. The olive-skinned man left the locker room and entered the auditorium. He ascended the stairs, reminded of the day he'd volunteered, and clenched onto the warhammer, thinking of Jade and Ro, and how he'd felt when he'd been informed of their terrible deaths. I am redeemable. I am. Lieutenant Holloway, Johanna Mason, and Finnick Adair each stood to the left of the stage. President Cohen stood closer to the center, up close and personal, maybe 5 or 6 feet from President Snow, who was sitting in a chair, bound and gagged. Lieutenant Holloway handed him the scribe listing the president's war crimes. It made his stomach hurt just looking at the numerous counts, printed in a tiny, elegant script. Before him was an attentive audience watching in anticipation. He caught Clove's excited eyes, and grew even more anxious. There was a brief speech by Cohen that didn't ease his nerves. Finally, he read, President Coriolanus Snow, age 76, convicted of 23 counts of facilitating prostitution, 8 counts of murder against governmental officials, 53 counts of attempted murder by poison, as well as numerous immeasurable crimes, such as the deaths of an unknown, but certainly high number of rebels, as well as the use of threats, force, and coercion against innocent children, adults, and elderly throughout all 12 districts of Panem. Felix finished reading the scroll, tossing it aside. They forgot to factor in the 1,725 counts of murder against Panem youth aged 12 to 18. Funny how easily our priorities are skewed. On this day, the 9th of December in the year 75, President Coriolanus Snow, you've been sentenced to execution. We thank you for your service. He studied the president, who only wore an arrogant smirk, entirely unaffected. The decision of where to begin came to mind, nearly consuming Felix whole. He could break Snow's arms, shatter his knee, gouge out his eyes, crush his spine, tear out his throat. Felix spoke so softly that only the president could hear him. Because of you, because of the Capitol, I never had the chance to be normal, but when this is all over, I'll never lay my hands in violence on another person ever again, because I'm better than that, and should have been all along. I am redeemable. I am. With a swift, deliberate motion, Felix swung his right arm and forced the hammer against the elder man's skull. It broke into chunks, pieces flying in various directions, and spewing a geyser of blood. The president slumped to the ground, dead on impact. Felix panted, taking a breath, and wiped the blood dotted along his cheeks. He dropped the soiled weapon and left the auditorium, avoiding his audience's eager eyes, only drowned out by the enormous applause that surrounded him. And he'd found a moment too late that vengeance didn't quench his soul. Underscore 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 underscore. Red, blaring alarms screeched. Soldiers, round up. Lieutenant Holloway ordered over the noise. President Cohen and Commander Boggs have been assassinated. 13's security has been compromised and we must keep our troops safe. Your task is to gather all Synergy rebels and family and descend to the lowest bunker in case of nuclear attack. Am I understood? Yes, sir, several of the soldiers yelled. As they dispersed, Cato ran down a long, narrow hallway towards his family's bunker. Once he got there, he banged on the door. Hazel cried out, hysterical, but no one answered. Cato banged again. Finally, he withdrew, and charged at the door. It took a few moments before it burst open, and he found his family cowering in a dark corner, his father covering Sandra, Oliver, and Hazel. We have to move. Cato yelled, relieved as he helped them up. Sandra bounced to her feet, 1-year-old Hazel flapping in her arms as his father picked up Oliver, who was crying as loudly as the baby. Cato urged him to relax, and Oliver quieted down, sniffling. They entered the hallway, quickly descending the stairs, and retreating to the lower levels. Sandra nearly tripped, clutching onto Cato's back for support. He steadied her, she gave him a grateful smile, and then they hit the heel of the stairs. Despite none of the soldiers being dressed as much, it was clear who'd been trained in the combat unit and who had not. Felix had Brooke in his arms, yelling at her to stop crying, which only intensified her wails. Sandra gently, but swiftly thrust Hazel in Mr. Elroy's arms, and snatched Brooke from Felix. The raven-haired man stalled his movements, trying to get a breath, and stop himself from tearing out every hair in his head. When Dicey and Harriet appeared together, looking confused, Felix screamed out in frustration, "Where the fuck is Clove?" Each of the boys looked to each other, before racing up the stairs one after the other. As they turned down her hallway, each was filled with a sense of dread. They stormed into Clove's room, calling out for her. A copious amount of blood stained her sheets, dripped onto the floor, and surrounded them, but she was nowhere to be found. They were almost certain they'd find her in Cato and Dicey's bunker, but when they opened the door, screaming her name, they were displeased not to find a soul in sight. A miserable thought entered Cato's mind. What if the Capitol had taken her? Cato ran out of the room, Felix and Dicey following him blindly. He stumbled over his 2 feet, hitting the floor hard, and refused to pull himself up. If something happened to Clove. Rage spread throughout his veins, and he knew in an instant each and every one of them would suffer an anguished end if Clove wasn't returned to him safely. He'd kill each and every one of them until the pain of her loss ebbed. "Cato, pull yourself together," Felix shouted over the alarms. The blonde shook his head, when Dicey darted off again. "Dicey, slow up," Felix yelled, and pulled Cato to his feet, dragging him clumsily behind himself. The redhead pushed past the door to a random bunker, before falling to his knees in mixed relief and exhaustion. A relieved smile covered his face. "Clove," he called out, crawling towards her small, cowering frame. Cato and Felix immediately followed his lead, getting to their knees, and staring at the paralyzed girl. She was covered in blood, but it didn't appear to be her own. What are you doing? Don't you hear the alarms? If we've been infiltrated, it's not safe. The Capitol killed Coin and Boggs. We have to retreat before they launch a nuclear attack." She shook her head severely, looking utterly vulnerable and defenseless. "It wasn't them." "What? Me? I killed her, killed him, killed them both, but they..." The dark-haired girl clutched onto Cato's arm, and he leaned her against him protectively. Felix narrowed his eyes in confusion. "They were our ally." Clove shook her head again. "No. They tried to kill me. We have to get out of here. Magnilda is in danger. I heard her screams. From all the way in too." "No fucking way, Jabberjays," Cato said hoarsely. They'd used them as a training tool when he'd been in candidacy training to become a tribute. Mars' screeches still haunted him to this day. Clove looked up to him with haunting eyes. "Coin never planned to let us go. She was going to kill us, all of us. We were just a means to an end. I couldn't let any more of us die. It had to end with Nero." Felix rubbed the back of her hand gently, doing what he always did in moments of trauma. "Breathe, Clove. Breathe." Relentless fury pricked at every inch of Cato's skin. What the hell had the scum from 13 done to her? She nodded through her tears. "She had one of the men from 13 take me and force me under a simulation, and then I woke up in a new life, where everyone had been taken from me, and there was no escape." It was dry, the sand beneath her hot. They were lost somewhere between time and space, standing in the middle of nowhere. Magnilda struggled against a bounty of peacekeepers, pleading, "Clove, don't let them take me. Clove." Clove ran towards her, when one of the peacekeepers pushed her harshly towards the ground, gritting out, "This is for the greater good." She knew that voice. "Daddy, let her go. She didn't do anything." His stone-cold eyes met hers, the green dark and threatening. "She betrayed us." "Betrayed us," echoed the peacekeepers, smirking eerily at her. "Dicey. Cato. Felix. Nero. Her mother. Her aunt." Caesar Flickerman appeared, a microphone dangling from his hands comically, with a time clock behind his head. Clove froze, confused, traumatized by the abstractness. Let the 75th annual Hunger Games begin. And as soon as the ticker hit 0, a massive explosion engulfed them all. The noise shattered her eardrums. Flames licked at her skin and poisoned the air. The smell of burning flesh turned her stomach inside out, and she curled defensively to protect herself from any more irreparable damage. When her eyes reopened, the girl from 12 stood there, her bow and arrow pointed directly at Clove. Where had she come from? "Where's your boyfriend?" the former tribute asked, still hanging on. Off in the distance, Clove saw Cato's ashy remains, smoke billowing in the wind. But, it wasn't just him. It was all of them. "No!" Clove screeched, covering her mouth with her hand, her heart in a stasis, the bile in her throat rising. "The Capitol did you a favor. They betrayed you, after all." The girl's grey eyes became steely, unsympathetic, and she turned away, towards Clove's sister. Clove's heart sunk, and she got to her knees. "No, please. Please don't do this." Clove begged. "How many people have asked you the very same thing?" Katniss asked her, icily. Clove was silent, and Katniss repeated, "Well." Tears streamed down Clove's face, terrified, because she didn't know. Her silence was answer enough. Katniss released the arrow, and in the distance, Magnilda let out a blood-curdling scream. "Clove!" Cato leaned her against his chest, allowing her small figure to slump against him. But as Clove informed them, that wasn't the end, it was only the beginning, as she was forced to relive the simulation again and again, 13 working to break her from the inside out, drive her to madness, and eliminate her as a threat. Clove continued to mumble, "She didn't think I'd break the simulation, but that was a pretty big mistake." President Coin stood impassively, as if unimpressed that the 17-year-old girl had broken her simulations and had come for her personally. "All my life, President Coin, everyone has made my decisions for me. My father enrolled me in the Annex. Felix, as my training mentor, decided when I trained and what subjects I studied. The instructors dictated my first kill. The Capitol tried to make me kill Cato, and when I won, I thought it was finally over, but no, see, it had only begun. Cato and Felix left and I was forced into joining the Capitol military to retrieve him. Then my father decided we would switch alliances mid-war, because his loyalty had long ago transferred without my knowledge. This was exacerbated when my best friend ushered me onto a hovercraft while I watched powerlessly as my cousin sacrificed himself. For what, I'm still not sure, and since I've gotten here, you've made most of my decisions. Here's a fascinating piece of information you might want to know. I'm not a patient woman, never been a good listener, and if you want to kill me, just be aware I will not go down without a fight." The president pressed a button under her desk. "Looking for Commander Boggs." Clove withdrew a knife from her boot. "He's indisposed at the moment, but don't worry, you two will be reunited soon enough." She tackled her to the ground, a menacing smile lighting up her face. There was not a moment of fear in Coin's eyes, but Clove knew all too well that she would fall. Her first hit was violent, uncoordinated. Coin's blood sloshed, coating her in scarlet red, and Clove relished the feeling. One slash was too many, but 1,000 never enough. Her blood was the only thing beautiful about her, Clove said with a manic, sick smile. "Clovey, it's over," Cato reassured her, anxiety stamped across his face. She leaned against him, and whispered brokenly, "I would never let them hurt you." "I know, baby." He brushed his lips against her forehead. "You've always been my best protector, but now it's time you let me protect you." Clove slumped into a peaceful sleep, and Cato gently rocked her, unsteady, but unafraid to dispose of whoever came for his fiancée next. No one would ever dare lay a finger on her ever again, and should they try. Felix wiped the blood staining his hands onto the lieutenant's carpet, continuing to hold Clove's hand and soothe Cato's shaking frame. "What now?" he asked faintly. "We go home. Underscore 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 alternate ending 12/12 underscore 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 underscore. The 1st of July, 1984. Clove longed for an agonized scream, for a petty victim to beg for their last breaths. The exercise she'd set up was good for her visual tension, but failed to deliver in all functional capacities. Still, Clove couldn't tell Cato that. She had promised to work on loosening her dependence on the parlor tricks, on the cheap magician's paltry efforts that kept her from unfolding on herself. If Cato knew how desperate she got, he might actually have the gall to leave her, but he was a sucker and she was sweet as pie. Like any other addict, Clove kept count. It had been 3,126 days since her last hurrah. By war's end, she'd murdered at least 75 individuals in the span of 6 years. 45 of those preceded her enlistment. Clove had always relished the way her victims' blood splattered on impact, the high pitch as they begged for mercy, the fear each man had as they faced their death, because in the end they were all the same, cowards under the guise of a brave face. It was only after her traumatic endeavor with President Coin that the last thread of her cognizance snapped. She fingered the weapon gingerly. In this tiny space, a 10x10 room, she was free. The art studio was hers to do with as she pleased, but only here. She was bound by commitments out of this room. Instantly, the dulling throwing knife hit the balloon and scarlet paint gushed down the wall, coating it in a stream of color. It was close, but never close enough to trick herself into believing it could be real. Clove grabbed an empty wine bottle, the neighboring alcoholic's silent reprieve, and threw it against the wall. An ear-splitting shatter filled the room. It helped when she imagined it a snow skull, spread across the auditorium floor. Late in December 75, Clove Holloway was sent to trial. It was a haziness she barely recalled. The judicial panel found her lacking the mental capacity to have formed the intent to kill President Coin. She didn't bother to correct them. Clove was declared insane. Had waited her whole life for the diagnosis, and there it was, in plain writing, on a legal document for public consumption. Once the charges had been amended, the boys, along with her father, had taken turns taking her to see the listening doctor, a man who worked with those suffering from mental anguish ranging from melodramatic to histrionic to horribly frenetic. As her breathing steadied, Clove picked up the last of the pieces of glass, sorted them, then dipped them into a variety of paints for ready use. Cato would love his gift. A dedication to their 20 years. 20 years, and he still made her heart race, her lips curve, and her eyes glimmer. She went into the kitchen, steaming a kettle of water over the stove, and cleaning her brushes. If her palms ever began to sweat, her wrists ache for a human target, then she was to implement a 5-minute window, telling herself she'd abstain from hurting others for 5 minutes. Theoretically, minutes would grow to hours, and hours to days, and eventually, at least, this was what they'd said, she wouldn't be tempted anymore. Nailed to the splitting plywood was a hanging calendar. She removed the nail and fastened it to the proper month. Today was the 1st of July. Written in the next date over, in bright pink marker, was Nellie's 23rd birthday. Hooray! Artfully crafted by her sister herself, and on the following day, the 3rd, in very small print, Fix is 28 years old today. They had forbidden her from prolonged periods alone. When they'd returned home, Dicey was told to escort her to retrieve her sister. And it just so happened to be a coincidence that Magnilda wore a teal bow in her hair that day, but Clove would have been all waterworks anyways. At 14, her sister was stunning, taller than her already, and nearly the spitting image of their young mother. It had brought hot tears to Clove's eyes. Callan had returned with 2 warm cups of peppermint tea. Dicey was buried in his mother's arms, refusing to let go. Clove had been in hysterics, hardly capable of sipping the warm beverage, so Magnilda had pushed the mugs away, and pulled her sister into her lap, gently running her hands through her hair as her sister had so often done for her. "Let it out, Loie. It's all right." Neither spoke of Nero, of their aunt, of what the war cost them. Only grieving together in shaky sobs. For months, Magnilda was the only thing that could bring Clove close to normal, to keep her from reaging in crisis mode. She sat on a stool, pouring the hot water, then steeping a tea bag. Clove jumped off the stool to raid her cabinets as the bag sank into her glass, when she stepped on a crinkly piece of artwork. While certainly not crafted by her own hands, it was equally, if not more, valuable. Clove looked at the piece with a small smile, before pinning it to the wall, lest it fall to the ground and be damaged irreparably. Underscore 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 underscore. You're out of shape, see Dicey taunted, a slick grin on his face. Cato leaned back, chastising, hardly. I'll have you know I bench press 350. The redhead arched his brows. Which I'm sure comes in really handy for the owner of a book sanctuary, meathead. So many things happened at once when they returned to District 2. Hazel said her first words. Dicey had taken up mining. Clove entered into long-term mental treatment, and Cato learned quickly that to survive, one needed a trade to call their own. One afternoon, when walking along the city line, he'd found a rundown, condemned corner store at the edge of town, right before the market. The owner had heckled him and Dicey in their youth, often accusing them of scaring away his customers by playing too loudly. When Cato had offered to buy it, the owner explained it was uninhabitable, but that hadn't been a problem. After all, it's not like Felix had anything better to do. So they refurbished the shop, making the necessary repairs, and reopened it as District 2's first book sanctuary. Conceptually, it was simple. One picked up a book, perused it to their heart's content, and then returned it for the next reader when they were finished. The Wagner family became so infatuated with the concept, and the good publicity, that they donated a generous grant to help keep the sanctuary self-sustaining. Felix hadn't been pleased, but Aniston had stepped in immediately as peacemaker. Just because I like you doesn't mean I have to like your family, and Felix had spat at her, irritably. Cato dodged left, and then agilely swung the old, wooden sword at Dicey's side. Point. Dicey sulked. Damn, he'd grown lethargic since ascending to a healthy body weight. At least as a scarecrow, he'd been swift. The redhead jumped forward, and Cato slid low, before Dicey tripped him up, and pointed his wooden sword over Cato's heart. Point. Cato then leaped forward, slashing ferociously at the open air, but never quite reaching him. Dicey's amber eyes glimmered mischievously as he rolled along the wall, and hit Cato's neck. Who says you don't get lucky twice? Cato jumped forward, pushed him to the ground, and smirked, his wooden sword over Dicey's back. You just don't, princess. However, while he bragged, Dicey turned around, swung, and then beamed, victorious. Don't be arrogant, see. Easing up, Cato threw him a water bottle. Good work, Dice. Dicey had immersed himself in work. Any work. Mining stone, laying bricks, developing blueprints. Anything to keep himself from wasting into nothingness. In an ideal world, he'd have been a peacekeeper, a real peacekeeper, not a violent fool of a man hiding behind a leather whip and a 20-year life sentence. Still, he saw the way his sister looked at them, the way her hands shook unwillingly when she passed one in the market, and the tremble in her shoulders made him regret ever having considered the choice. Years passed, and he explored a very diverse line of work until the year 80, when Felix was nominated as region leader of 2 West, serving a similar role as one might expect of a mayor in a smaller district. Once he'd gotten comfortable in his role, Felix had asked Dicey if he would be interested in the position of commissioner as part of his crime reduction task force. The redhead had been, naturally, suspicious. And when he'd said as much to Felix, the young man had shrugged, humble, and truthful. You've taken so many odd jobs over the years that everyone knows you, and you're one of the only people I know who actually cares about others because it's the right thing to do. When you do something, you give it your whole heart, and that's what I want from someone in this position. I want someone who cares about the people in 2 West, not someone who will throw the poor to the dirt and allow the wealthy to glide on by without recourse. We've seen the consequences of that, Dicey. Flattery got Felix everywhere. But am I even qualified for whatever this position is? Come on, Dicey. Do I look like I dally in nepotism? Course you're qualified. Dicey's responsibility became to enmesh himself into the community and find why laws were being violated, what services were failing to be provided, what behaviors they'd been encouraging in their youth, where the highest areas of crime were, and how the people of 2 West felt they could best be aided. His job, in other words, was to be a source of community support. Though, it was difficult to see so many of the ex-trainees with an abundance of energy and nowhere to expel it. Some had been designated as criminals under Felix's reign, as the raven-haired man had outlawed non-consensual sex, for any age, not just 12 and under, murder, against anyone, not just political officials, violence against children, against anyone, except to protect oneself and others, and yet, at the same time Felix's office had loosened the reins on laws and sentencing for petty crimes. No